This episode is sponsored by Active 911, a respected leader in the emergency communication and software field, providing alerting, mapping, and scene resources for over 500,000 first responders worldwide. Now, as you know, I only bring sponsors on this show who are A, coming from an altruistic place, and B, truly bringing solutions to problems. And the origin story of Active 911 begins with volunteer firefighter and tech entrepreneur Joseph Sullivan. After missing a critical call from a dispatch error, Joseph set out to create a solution to ensure that we are not only dispatched on time, but also provide us with resources and information for the call and location. So there are 3 different products under the Active 911 umbrella. The first is Active Alert, a dispatch system integrated into a CAD connection, providing fast, reliable alerting, maps, data, pre-plans, hydrant locations, and even the locations of incoming units and their specialties. The second arm is Active Comms. Now, many of us have experienced problems when it came to communication using our traditional radios, so Active 911 found a way of tapping into the incredible capabilities of modern-day smartphones and integrate that into our communication, providing both increased range and low latency. So to learn more about Active 911 or to try their free trial, go to active911.com. And if you want to hear more about the origin and spectrum of products that they offer, listen to episode 1243 of the Behind the Shield podcast with the creator and founder, Joseph Sullivan. Welcome to the Behind the Shield podcast. As always, my name's James Gearing, and this week it is my absolute honor to welcome on the show board-certified psychologist with a specialized expertise in operational psychology, criminal behavior analysis, and human performance optimization, Dr. Stacy Cecchet. Now, in this conversation, we discuss a host of topics, from her journey into the world of psychology, specializing in pediatrics, her work with the Internet Crimes Against Children Unit, the impact of that work on our first responders, pedophiles in power, unchecked narcissism, the ripple effects of the pandemic, important red flags for parents, and so much more. Now, before we get to this incredible conversation, as I say every week, please just take a moment. Go to whichever app you listen to this on, subscribe to the show, leave feedback, and leave a rating. Every single 5-star rating truly does elevate this podcast, therefore making it easier for others to find. And this is a free library of well over 1,200 episodes now. So all I ask in return is that you help share these incredible men and women's stories so I can get them to every single person on planet Earth who needs to hear them. So with that being said, I introduce to you Dr. Stacy Cecchet. Enjoy. Well, Stacy, I want to start by saying 2 things. Firstly, thank you to our mutual friend, Brad Beeler, for making this connection. And this is a long time coming. And secondly, I want to welcome you onto the Behind the Shield podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me. And huge thanks to Brad as well.
So where on planet Earth are we finding you this morning?
I'm in the Pacific Northwest and we have sunshine today. So it's a fine day over here.
I'm glad to hear it. I'm in Florida, so we have sunshine almost every day. And this time of year, it's a lot of sunshine. It's too much sunshine.
Too much sunshine. You'll never hear a Pacific Northwesterner complain about that.
No, that's why people come here for a week and then they go home in the summer. And it's beautiful. I love it here. But yeah, our favorite time of year, my favorite time of year here is the winter. It's gorgeous then. All right. Well, let's start at the very beginning of your timeline. So tell me where you were born and tell me a little bit about your family dynamic, what your parents did, how many siblings.
Oh, okay. Well, I was born and raised in Northern California, raised for, I would say probably, half my youth, and then finished up the the last few years of high school up in the Pacific Northwest area. And I have two sisters, and like so many people in the first responder space, I feel like you have people that have uh, these really beautiful developmental histories. You know, they come from first responder families, or they come from families that have these really inspiring stories that led them into this space, or, you know, they're really faith based and that led them into being a first responder. Or you find people that had a very, very difficult developmental history. And you know, I think it's something like 50% of first responders have at least one like adverse childhood experience, which already even just the one is like 15% higher than the general population. So yeah, it's always interesting asking about developmental history in this population.
It's funny. I've heard even higher statistics, so that a lot of us have an ACEs of 6. And you know, when I compare that, and maybe it's a skewed perspective, but a lot of the people I've had on the show that are wearing uniform, myself included, there are a lot of elements that you can see created a desire in a young child to build an armor, to be the protector, to be part of a tribe where they feel safe. You know, the very, very tenets that we find in our professions.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, the idea of serving your community, right? That can be done in so many different ways, but there's something very unique about an individual that chooses to serve their community in a first responder capacity, right? There's something qualitatively different about that. And yeah, you're absolutely right. There's a huge part of it is, you know, wanting to have that family, that tribe, and wanting to have that sense of safety and security. Although I feel like for at least for our law enforcement community right now, there is not a very much of a sense of safety for them at all, with all the anti-law enforcement sentiment and the idea of even feeling safe going out in the communities that they serve isn't present for everybody, depending on the community that they're in. So we've just seen fundamental changes in that. It's since 2020, and you know that's had really significant consequences for their mental health status.
Well, I know I'm putting you in a corner because you're the one normally asking these questions. So without being specific then, when you reflect back on your formative years, were there elements you think that contributed to you also being someone who wanted to stop people being hurt?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you know, like so many of our colleagues, I've had a difficult developmental history, and I always felt really strongly about making sure that kids felt safe at home, felt safe at school, had trusted adults that they could go to. I mean, there's so much research out there on the impact of adverse childhood experiences, and we talk about the impact of ACEs, you know, throughout the lifespan. But there's also this other part of research that talks about how even having just one safe adult, a teacher, a coach, a neighbor, a mentor, is life changing for kids. And so, from a very young age, I was always very interested in the psychology behind that and in serving our community and volunteering. I always did a lot of volunteer work, usually in a space where I was, you know, working with kids or families. And I just kind of carried that through as I went through college and graduate school and my residency and my postdoc and all of the things, and was able to really shape my career into something that's incredibly meaningful to me because of that.
What about sports and exercise? What were you playing and doing when you were in the school ages?
Well, I was one of those kids that played the sports, even though I was horribly uncoordinated. So huge thanks to coaches and teammates that allowed me to participate, even though I am not. I don't have great gross motor skills. I'm the person that like walks into the corner of the table all the time and, you know, rams my elbow or into the door jamb. But I grew up swimming competitively. And I mean, from probably, I think I started swimming, gosh, maybe when I was 6. It was called Minnows, was the swim team for like the littles. It's adorable. And I swam all through high school. And then I played volleyball in high school as well. And then when I went to college, it was mostly just, you know, like independently working out or you know, doing some kind of sports with friends or whatever, but nothing formal or organized.
We've got a swimming facility that just built about 3 or 4 years ago near me, and they literally have, I think, events from all over the state come and host there. It's an Olympic-sized pool, and they've got strength and conditioning, all the things. But they got a summer camp at the moment, and I think it's the young kids, but it's the manatees. And I was thinking, I don't know if that's the best name for maybe kids that are self-aware about their body being called the manatees in that particular group. So they might
Oh
want to
my
rebrand that
gosh.
one.
Yeah, maybe they might want to rebrand that. Yeah.
So you mentioned about the mentor. Was interesting because this is a conversation. I'm sure we'll take a deeper dive into this, but the ACEs, we have a high kind of score on average in the first responder and military profession, and I'm told that it kind of mirrors what you see in the incarcerated population as well, which shows you that you have hurt children getting to a crossroads, and their mentor might be a history teacher or a sports coach, or it might be a drug dealer or a gangbanger, and then off you go to that direction. So talk to me about that mentor, and then if you want to even expand on that topic as far as that, my philosophy is we all have the potential to really heal from this trauma. You're not labeled by it, but the mentors in your life do often dictate which direction you go.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I also think, when we talk about resilience, we talk about it as if resilience is kind of the be all end all of navigating adverse childhood experiences or things like that. But I think one of the things that mentorship can instill in children, or really can instill in anybody at any age, is the addition of grit and hardiness. And it's not, resilience is the ability to overcome adversity. And it actually doesn't really imply anything about how you're going to be once you overcome the adversity. You're overcoming the adversity, and that's what resilience means. And if you're lucky, you're able to have post traumatic growth. So that's the hardiness piece. That's coming out stronger than you were at the beginning of things. And that requires a growth mindset. That requires believing in something bigger than yourself in some sort of way. It doesn't have to be religious, right? It could be in any capacity, but you have to be able to make meaning from your suffering and meaning from the adversity and seek to grow from that. And that's something that I think a lot of people learn from mentorship, from teachers talking about it, from reading about it in books or seeing something inspiring in movies, from witnessing it in your friends. And then the other part of that is grit. And grittiness is, again, adversity, overcoming adversity, but it's overcoming adversity in pursuit of a goal. So it's being goal oriented, even when the deck is stacked against you, and doing hard things and having really good delayed gratification. And that can also be something that's really hard to learn or understand if you don't get to see that modeled in your home or in your community. And the only time you see that is maybe if a teacher is encouraging you or a coach is encouraging you. So mentorship really just provides so many gifts to everybody in all stages of life, not just kids.
I'm jumping ahead again, but I think we're already kind of opening this door. When I first was made aware of the mental health crisis conversation in the first responders was literally only about 10 years ago. We had a local battalion chief take his own life, and he put a Facebook post on. And that's really what kind of, ran through social media, which obviously back then was still being looked at a lot more. And it initiated this conversation. Obviously, there were some people in our community that have been talking about this for a long time, and most of us just weren't paying attention or weren't aware of their work. And so the learning curve has been extremely steep, from pretty much ignorant through to the conversations we're having today. And my perspective is we've kind of got our trouser leg caught on the sad story of first responder PTSD, and they keep killing themselves, and the alcoholism. And those are obviously a real thing. We know it's a real thing. But when it's a sad story, it's hard to break away from that kind of victim mentality that's attached to it. And these people are a victim, and we'll obviously unpack the compounding factors to that. But Where I think we're missing the point, and I know this is an area that you specialize in, is the performance conversation. That when you take those struggles that you had when you were younger, and I would like to see it happen at the front door of a fire department or a police department, where they say, look, the fact that you're here, you've probably been through some shit, let's be honest. So let's start right there.
Yes.
But for you to operate in a flow state, or as close to a flow state, in a gunfight, in a primary search in the middle of a structure fire, a pediatric cardiac arrest at 3 a.m, we need you to have your mind clear. So we're going to use the tools to work towards a flow state the same way as your favorite football player or baseball player would to win, their
Yes.
championship. And then that puts hope
Exactly.
and positivity and excitement into the mental health conversation. And if you focus on performance, obviously you're pulling people away from suicide ideation and addiction and all these other areas. So I think we're missing that in my profession, that growth mindset when it comes to post-traumatic growth, and how exciting James 2.0 could be if he's able to, work through some of the things of his early life, and then breath work and meditation and work on his sleep, and now be an optimal firefighter or police officer.
Yes, 100%, 100%. I do a lot of work, around operational readiness and functional wellness and human performance optimization. And I think one of the most important things that I talk about when I'm working with peer support teams or training command, or even just working one on one with people, is that we are not operating in a silo, and we treat behavioral health as if it's its own kind of special pillar. And behavioral health is not operating in a vacuum. And just like you said, it's impacted by, nutrition, sleep, our family relationships, our interpersonal relationships, our cognitive style, our emotion regulation skills, our developmental history, and how activated our central nervous system is. And, there are so many components to it. And we're not going to make the progress that we should be making if we continue to think of behavioral health as something siloed. And I'm working with, agencies now that are, looking at the role of financial stress in wellness, and they're bringing in financial advisors and providing financial workshops for their people. I know so many first responders that will stay in this field much longer than they should, even when they're eligible for retirement, because they don't feel like they can retire financially. Maybe they've got a kid in high school, or a kid still in college, or they had a divorce and lost half their pension, and they will tell me, I want to leave, but I can't. And if we can help people understand from the very beginning, like you were saying, as soon as they walk in the door at the academy, what financial health and wellness looks like and how to plan appropriately, that could also be a huge game changer for people. And yeah, there are so many areas that could be addressed. And I think that until we're able to really look at things holistically, we're going to kind of plateau with wellness.
Absolutely. Well, kind of going back on the timeline again, when you were in the school age, were you already thinking about the world of psychology, or was there something else in your mind?
Oh, geez. You know, I think that I don't know if I would say I was thinking about the world of psychology, because I probably didn't know much about that really in like elementary school and middle school. But I definitely had an awareness of, friends that I had where it felt like maybe something was happening at home and they weren't safe, or something felt weird. And kids are really good at identifying when something feels weird. They'll be able to say, it makes my tummy hurt, or or my body feels really tight. They might not be able to verbalize all of the things that an adult would, but kids can identify those things really well. And so I definitely had an awareness of like when I would go to friends' houses, or interact with somebody, and my body would feel weird. And I remember that I had a friend in middle school who was not safe in her home, because her mother was really violent, and I remember, really struggling to understand how that continued to happen, because I told the school, I told my parents. I'm pretty sure that CPS made a visit, just based on things that I heard from that friend as we got older, but nothing was actually done about it. And I remember being really distressed about that. And that's kind of the theme throughout my formative years, is recognizing when people are in these situations that they don't feel safe or they're not healthy, and thinking about ways that we can help, that I could help, either as a friend or a peer or something like that, help them move past that in some way. And obviously, as a kid, there's nothing that I could really do other than, you tell a safe grown up, or you tell a teacher or something like that. But as I got older into high school and college and graduate school, realizing how powerful it is to just listen to somebody and just provide a space where they can just say the things, right? They can finally talk about what's happening and not see, horror or judgment, or have somebody telling them, well, did you do this thing? You should say this thing, this or that. But just the power of just being present with somebody is really transformative sometimes.
We had the pandemic obviously a few years ago, and I've heard this from several people in your field or similar fields, that one of the biggest tragedies about these schools closing down was a lot of times that was where the outcries were made. That was where the children felt safe. They were confiding in teachers or counselors, and that was taken away for some of them, a year plus. What was your perspective from the children's mental health point of view of the way that the pandemic was handled? I mean, obviously there was initially a threat and people had to adjust, but the unspoken ripple effect of the way that they isolated children during that time.
Oh, I mean, I think we're still seeing downstream impacts from that just we had no way to really anticipate. Um, I think there's a number of there's so many ways actually our kids were impacted by that. Um, you know, in so in the area that I work in, I work with law enforcement, and I've been embedded with law enforcement for almost a decade, but working collaboratively with law enforcement for almost 2 decades at this point. And I tend to think about behavioral health impacts on kids, not just in terms of the traditional behavioral health impacts, depression, anxiety, social skills, things like that, but also in terms of vulnerability to exploitation. And we of course we saw kids really struggling to learn and practice developmentally appropriate social skills. We saw kids, really struggling to learn the academic skills that they needed. We saw kids becoming more and more isolated. I mean, so many families had to work, right? And so the kids were on the computer doing school, or supposed to be doing school, and there was very little supervision because parents were working, whether parents were working on their computer in the other room, or in a first responder field, and actually going to work physically. I mean, just these kids were really, really isolated for so many reasons, and isolated from their peers in ways that they had never been before. And then you look at, the role of masking in child development. So of course you have the mask mandates and concerned for viral transmission and things like that. And so masking is what it is. But in terms of, like, when you look at the part of the face that's covered with a mask, you have these kids that are only seeing this part of faces for sometimes years. And 70% of our communication is nonverbal. And so we're having these kids that are not learning how to read any sort of nonverbal communication on somebody's face because all they're seeing is this. And maybe we'll see, research is always at least 2 years behind, what we're seeing anecdotally, just because of how long it takes to spin up a research study, conduct the research, get the findings, publish it, all of the things. Maybe we'll see that some kids now have some like supercharged ability to read, just like the micro ocular expressions. I don't know, but I feel like there's so much that happens in the rest of our face and even in our shoulders and our posture, and our kids just didn't get the opportunity to learn how to read those skills in others in real time. And I think that that's had a lot of impacts in how kids are navigating the social environment. Now, so many kids missed all these major developmental milestones, like, high school dances and prom and graduation ceremonies. I mean, they were just robbed of so much. And then you look at, anxiety about, getting sick, or anxiety about germs, or, things that maybe kids weren't particularly concerned about, wasn't even on their radar on the front end. And now they're very, very worried about that. And you have grief and loss from family members that passed away, that, they probably would have had in their lives for longer. And then in addition to all of that, you have kids unsupervised on the internet. And wherever kids are is where we have our child predators. And so we had more kids being victimized online than we have ever had before. And our law enforcement officers and NCMEC and all these incredible agencies designed to protect kids were not equipped to deal with that. And we're still flooded with reports of online child exploitation. There are so many. We could have every law enforcement officer in the country, working on these cases, and we would still have a backlog. And so it's just had these massive impacts on child victimization and exploitation.
And this is what we need to hear. This is the thing. I'm not out here beating a drum that James Gearing has all the answers. I asked the people boots on the ground, the people that were in the hotspots that did have a lot of the fatalities, the people that, built morgues outside hospitals that never got used once and had to disassemble them again. The people in your field, the teachers. I mean, so many of these voices, because the biggest tragedy, aside from obviously the human losses, was the fact that no lessons were learned, and no one seemed to care about, well, what did we do well? What did we do wrong? What should we change next time? And now we know it's pretty hard proof that, and coming from a profession that wears a mask, there's only a certain kind of mask that's fit, that is actually going to make a difference. And I was at a doctor's office with my wife a couple of days ago, and there was a sign on the side saying, wear a cloth mask. I don't know if it was still left over, but a cloth mask. So cut up a t-shirt, put some elastic on it and slap it over. That's not going to do anything. So you're, like you said, what are the things that were necessary? Isolating people with, pre-existing conditions, autoimmune disease, the elderly, keep them away, keep them safe, but don't tell the children that they're murderers and force vaccines on them if there's no efficacy of the vaccine. If that's, if the children are able to navigate this virus and still go to school. So it's not that, oh, you guys were all wrong or you guys were all right. It's just, okay, what was right, what was wrong, and what was very damaging, so that when the next virus comes, what are we going to do differently? And I think if it wasn't, if we didn't need, for example, to have a mask on everyone, then that's an important takeaway. If we didn't need to stop everyone from going to work or going to school, that's an important takeaway. How can we adjust it? But if we don't have the conversations like you and I are having now, retroactively, as we call it in the fire service, a tailball critique, then you're not going to learn any lessons. And it was a very much, as soon as it was done, sweep it under the rug. But as you just said, but people are still suffering from the poor decisions that were made then. And when that includes our children being preyed upon, we sure as hell should be talking about this.
Yeah, I think, technology moves so quickly that it is so hard to anticipate, even 6 months from now, how offenders will victimize our kids online, because there's always something new coming out, a new app, a new game, some new way of exploitation. And so I understand it can be really daunting to figure out how to proactively combat that. But I agree. I mean, we definitely need to be addressing it and talking about it and thinking about what we can put in place proactively. And, regardless of what comes next, let's say something comes next and absolutely everybody has to wear masks. Let's say we all agree, which would never happen, nobody would ever agree about all the things, but in this pretend world, even in that setting where legitimately everybody has to wear a mask, I think that we can learn about from this past pandemic how viral transmission occurs in open spaces. And I mean, seeing kids, at playgrounds, even now, sometimes still wearing masks. I think that there are probably some flexible ways that we can think about navigating, supporting our kids' development in healthy ways. Um, it's really hard to do in the moment when your limbic system has hijacked your brain and you go into your fight, flight, freeze, fawn space, and you're just in this survival mode, and you can't really think through downstream impacts or even what can we learn from this right now and how can we change it. And I talked to so many psychologists during the pandemic, and in here with the Washington State Department of Health, I was able to work on a behavioral health strike team that was pushing out guidance across the state for not only first responders and behavioral health providers, but teachers and pediatricians and people around the state looking at kids' mental health and teachers' mental health and all these things, and some ways to help promote connection and all of these really important pro-social skills that have such huge impacts on mental health. And I think that there is a lot that we can learn from that and be more aware of when this happens again in the future.
What was interesting, you just made me think about this because I got a friend who's a leader in the SEAL teams who lives in your area in the Pacific Northwest. And when we first spoke about this virus, I've never heard him so angry, so animated, so fearful. And this is someone who, was in combat for decades. And as you then saw, like you said, this kind of World War I trench mentality, where you were either all on one side or all the other. Like in the podcast we were talking before we hit record, the reason I do 3 a week is because of COVID. Because I was looking left and looking right and going, why aren't people just saying, yeah, in the middle, there's some of this and some of this, but what are the
Yeah.
actionable things that you can do in the meantime? So I had nutritionists and farmers and psychologists and strength and conditioning coaches and all the people, so at least they could access that information while they were being told they couldn't leave their home. But the ease with which the community was cleaved to the point that friends and families were broken apart, to me, and I say this with compassion, not with judgment, really alluded to the fact that there was a simmering mental health crisis nationally, that people could go from 0 to 100 without the ability to take a step back and critically think about this thing, wait a few weeks, see the results. Are their bodies lying everywhere in the street? And then kind of de-escalate. But it would seem very, very quickly from 0 to 100, where if you didn't subscribe to the Chinese conspiracy or wrap everyone in plastic. If you were in the middle, you were a heretic. If you didn't go one or the other, then you were vilified, you were demonized. And that was almost, again, one of the saddest things, to see how quickly people were dragged to one of the two extremes.
It's interesting for me from a psychological standpoint, to think about that, because prior to the pandemic, it's hard for me to identify very many times in my lifetime where I saw something that was so polarizing for every community. Of course, you have things that will be polarizing and only in certain groups or things like that. But this was, impacting people across all walks of life. And I mean, of course, you have things like, the Vietnam War, right? That was very polarizing. But it's hard for me to recall that really happening in my lifetime prior to COVID. And now I feel like, and I'm sure there's something I'm not thinking of. But now I feel like that's almost the default. We look at politics, right? And people are like all one side or all the other. And there is very little middle ground and very little discussion of like, yeah, what about some of this? And what about some of this? And it's just the other side is demonized. It doesn't matter. And we see the same thing happening where, people are discontinuing friendships, they're cutting family members out of their lives, they're having massive conflicts with coworkers. And I feel like it's becoming more and more common to see these really, really divisive responses to things that I wouldn't expect to create such a divide necessarily.
I'm going to take you on one more rabbit hole, then we'll get back to your psychology journey. But this has been
I'm
an
here for
interesting.
it. I'm here for it.
I just had Gabor Mate on the show, and he had actually talked about this in his book. And this is a realization I only had probably about a year ago. And it was listening to one of Joe Rogan's guests just make a comment. And they were talking about, people of power and abuse of power and that kind of thing. And Joe had made some comment like, well, the head of this drug company is obviously a turd or whatever phrase he used. And this guy said, no, but he's hurting too. And then they just carried on with the conversation. But I'm like, well, wait a second, time out. As you and I both know, when there's a mental health conversation in our kind of atmosphere, it's the firefighter, the cop, the dispatcher, the EMT that's struggling, and it's the people on the street, it's us. But there's no conversation about mental health or even sociopath elements in positions of power that are incredibly dangerous. And what I've kind of realized now is if you are, again, that hurt child that never did any work, that then you could, in theory, become the head of Purdue Pharma, where your product kills 100,000 Americans every year and you sleep soundly in your bed, or the head of William Morris Tobacco, or maybe even a president or a prime minister. And this is an interesting kind of, new conversation is we are held to what they call fit for duty. If James can't do the job, he's struggling, he's drinking too much, whatever, I'm taken off the rig until hopefully you get me the tools that I need help and I come back stronger. And now I'm a beacon of light for other people of healing. But we don't have that conversation with these people who, arguably at some point are sociopaths. If you're the head of, if you're the Sackler family and you deliberately prey upon communities knowing that addiction will happen so you can profit, that is sociopathy. So what is your take on that? We're always looking at the ground of the men and women in the uniform, but some of these positions of power, some of these companies that really, truly are a detriment to the men, women, and children of America that profit off them, the mental health conversation of some of those positions, and the conversation is if they are not fit for duty, should they be in that position in the first place?
I mean, there's been a lot of research done looking at we'll use the term snakes in suits. That's the name of a book that Robert Hare wrote, who's a Canadian researcher, psychologist who has done a lot of work looking at psychopathy and how to assess for psychopathy. And the reality is that we think of a psychopath as somebody that's a serial killer. The reality is that many serial killers are not psychopaths, but that's the only kind of portrayal that we have of them in, media or books or things like that usually. But the reality is that in order to be a CEO of a Fortune 500 company or, hold a position where you have a lot of power over a lot of people, you do have to have some of those traits in order to be really successful. I mean, you don't have to be. Certainly there are CEOs that are lovely human beings and are not psychopaths in any way, shape, or form. But it is not uncommon to see some of the people that are in the highest positions of power or, have the most, status in a very large company have traits that are are congruent with psychopathy. This callousness, this superficial charm, really lack of regard for others, a parasitic lifestyle. They just like suck up whatever they need from everybody else and just kind of move on. No empathy or regard for the 100,000 people they're laying off, right? That's why their company is so successful. They'll buy a company and just, cleave it in two and fire all these people, don't think twice about it, cut all these corners or make all these changes and get this huge profit, right? And that's their bottom line. I think it takes a particular type of person to do that and to really only focus on whatever their bottom line is, typically profit. There are some people that do that very well, and they're probably not well themselves. And so I think that we do see that a lot. We see that in leadership in first responder agencies as well. One of the things that I like to point out when I'm talking to people and they're really struggling with, someone in leadership or struggling with a public figure or, something like that, is that, a lot of times that person that they're struggling with, whether it's somebody they actually know, right, or somebody that they don't really know, but they're still struggling, that person is not well. And once I'm able to kind of reframe it, because people will say like, oh, that person's crazy. But we use crazy as in such a colloquial way that doesn't really have a lot of, it can mean so many things, doesn't have a lot of specific meaning. But to say, yeah, you're right. Actually, I think that person's probably really unwell. And you can see this change on their face where they're realizing, oh, yes, actually you're right. They probably are really unwell. And it doesn't negate, whatever inappropriate behavior or actions that they've done, but it's a different lens with which to interpret that behavior. And then it also helps, I think, shift the locus of control, right? Like, so that this is a them issue, right? This is about them. They are not well, and this is about them. This is not about me. And being able to reframe that can be really powerful.
Well, I think this is the danger, and going back to what you said about the polarization, which again has spanned, two administrations now, 10 years at least, where when you put someone who is just not fit for a position and, they're benefiting from a divided nation, then this is now affecting 350 million people because of one or two people that never did the work. And then the goal is to address this with compassion and empathy and say, look, this is a fire chief, for example. They go home 5 o'clock every night. Their people are working 80-hour weeks because of mandatory overtime. They've got numerous suicides. Fire chief sleeps at night. This is a problem. Like you said, this is the same thing. This isn't a president now, it's a fire chief. The goal is that that person goes and does the work and they come back, as we just talked about, post-traumatic growth, better for it, compassion and empathy returned. And now they turn the ship around and they start being the leader. That's the ultimate goal. But if
That would
that's
be
not,
incredible.
yeah. So, but option B is if they don't, then they do not need to be in that position because they don't have the traits that it takes. And, it's very, very simple. A leader brings people together. They care about the well-being, the safety of their fire department, their nation, whatever it is. But a tyrant, a dictator, divides and crushes and rules with fear. So, just like you said, there are so many good examples of great leaders. I think the president of Finland is a person to really look at the moment. I mean, he's so articulate. They're a very, very healthy country, an amazing education system. So that's someone you can say, all right, well, then we need someone kind of looks like this guy or, a female version of or whatever. But if you just are dying on your sword because you swore that you would be all left or all right, you're also part of the problem because you're not acknowledging that the person that you think is your messiah is actually someone who's mentally ill.
I think a challenge that I see a lot with the first responder community is that it's very difficult to hold leadership accountable. So if you have a chief or a commander or a deputy chief or assistant chief or somebody that has a lot of power, it can be really hard to hold them accountable. from the perspective of the people on the bottom, and so often, especially in government, what I see is, the problematic supervisors just get promoted out instead of actually having a real consequence. And until we're able to stop that, promoting problem people out of their position and just removing them, to just continue the damage that they're inflicting, until we're able to stop that, until we're able to hold people accountable and also provide effective corrective action, right? Just having a punitive response, certainly for some people, having a punitive response, especially if their behavior isn't really congruent with who they are, right? They acted in a way that they're already embarrassed about, and now there's a punitive response. They're unlikely to repeat that behavior. But for somebody that really doesn't care about how they're behaving and isn't likely to take responsibility, just having a punishment isn't going to do anything. We're not very good at thinking about what the corrective action should be. And I'm embedded with a number of law enforcement agencies across our state, and it's really incredible how many agencies I work with that are now approaching me when there is, an internal investigation occurring, and they're saying, "Hey, we want to better understand." How a behavior like this occurs and what does that mean? Is this actually a manifestation of somebody that's really struggling with a behavioral health issue? And what sort of intervention can we offer or can we recommend? Instead of just saying, no, we're going to put you on admin leave for 25 days and then you can come back to work. Now they're saying, what if we offer them therapy? What if we offer them this great, substance abuse treatment or, support in this very specific way? And that is how we help grow our first responder community in a really healthy direction. That's how we create this post-traumatic growth. And that's what we need to be doing instead of just having these punitive responses or just ignoring the issue altogether.
Well, this is what I've said. You get a lot of people that say they're dealing with someone at the moment, they're, DUI or, whatever it was. And I always ask them, what were they like when you hired them? Oh man, they were amazing. The best rookie we ever had. And and they won this award. It's like, okay, so then don't you think that some of the reason why they're struggling now is the job itself? And if you just let them go, you've done a huge disservice because you have an opportunity. This person now is obviously taken a nosedive emotionally. And so wrapping them around in the resources they need, again, going back to the post-traumatic growth, they can not only be where they were before, but even better than they were before. And I'm sure you've heard this a million times. The people that did the work, people that had the courage to say, I need help, and then into whatever it was, whether it was just simply talk therapy or they went on a psychedelic retreat or whatever the perfect toolbox for them, their own unique toolbox was, and they come out the other end, every single one of those people, like, dude, it was crazy. Like, once I went back to the station, people would pull me to the corner all over the place and be like, hey, how did you do that? Because I've been going through some stuff. So behind this mask, so many people are struggling. But if you just say, the moment you mess up, we're going to terminate you. To give you a parallel, my son was in middle school and was going through some stuff emotionally. He was seeing a counselor. There was some kind of not physical violence, but very toxic relationship between his mother and her boyfriend at the time. And it was definitely having an effect on him. And again, that feeling safe, as you said. And he was crying in school one day and they put him on a 72-hour hold without even telling me.
What?
Yes, I swear to God. I called because I didn't have a call from him. He normally called me to say he was on the bus and on his way home. And they said, oh, Mr. Gearin, this is the principal. We're dealing with your son right now. We'll let you know. I call back, nothing. And then they tell me, oh, he's in the psych facility. Now, that was something that was happening in Florida. And I, added to all the voices that were already, fighting it. And someone had already put in legislation to get it changed. But it was a knee jerk after Parkland. And I pulled police records, and there were over 100 children had been Baker acted in that year alone. So what do you think that did for the little boys and girls of, at this point, the Liberty Middle School in Ocala? How often do you think they were going to tell people how they're feeling now? When you said, the moment you say that you're struggling in any way, we're going to take your shoelaces and your belt, and we're going to put you in a white room for 3 days, and you can't see your parents. And the ripple effect of that, we're still unwrapping to this day. But this is to your point with the first responders. If you have that punitive only lens in our profession, and you tell a cop you're going to take his gun the moment he says he's struggling, or she, then all you're doing is telling people, hey, don't actually tell us about your mental health. I mean, we'll just find out when you stick that gun in your mouth. But apart from that, just keep it to yourself. And it couldn't be more, more toxic, more, the polar opposite of what is absolutely needed. And like you said, even if someone's done something a little bit more, unwarranted, like a DUI or something like that, this is a red flag that's held straight in your face. That someone that was an amazing employee is now hurting. And by disciplining them only and not giving them the outlets that they need, you're just disregarding the years of service they gave you before.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I have a task force that I worked with in another state that was an Internet Crimes Against Children task force. And when I first started connecting with them, I had met them at a conference, and I was talking to the task force commander and some of the sergeants, and they were telling me that they had been asking their agency for wellness programming for their ICAC task force because everybody was really struggling. And internet crimes against children is a whole nother level of crime type for people to be exposed to, and it's fundamentally different, I think, than what we see in a lot of other spaces. And it requires, I think, unique wellness programming. And so these investigators, these supervisors were saying to their agency, hey, we need wellness programming specific for our investigators that are doing this work. What are our options for that? And the agency came back to them and said, okay, we hear that you are not doing well because of this work. So what we're going to do is we're going to have you do a fitness for duty evaluation every 6 months. And I was appalled. I was appalled and absolutely horrified that it could not be a worse response. And all that did is exactly what you said, is it taught this group of people that they not only can they not tell anybody at their agency when they're not doing okay, they cannot ask for help, but they are not safe. They are not safe in their role, because the first time that somebody even suspects that they are struggling, there will be a potentially catastrophic consequence to their career. And it is so unjust and so disrespectful to all of the years of service and sacrifice that our first responders have made. It is just horrifying.
So let's flip that on its head. What are the models that you've seen that should be held as the gold standard in our profession for, continuous, obviously, access to mental health counseling, and then, God forbid, someone really enters a crisis mode?
So we're in a pretend world right now where everybody has all the funding they need and there are all the culturally competent providers available. So in this pretend world, I think the gold standard is looking at behavioral health through the lens of functional wellness and operational readiness. So you would have, a culturally competent clinician available for behavioral health support, but you would also have culturally competent nutritionists, culturally competent physical and occupational therapists, right? Because there are very unique injuries that first responders experience and very unique types of muscle strain that first responders experience. And there are specific ways that they can go through physical therapy or occupational therapy and correct that. And if they don't have a clinician that's culturally competent, that's going to be really problematic. So having somebody available like that, having somebody available for financial counseling and to help, with financial advising, and all of these things really should be available starting at the academy level or even pre-academy workshops talking about this. There also should be family-based support. We're terrible at that. So many first responders that I know will tell me that they they want to protect their spouse from the reality of this work, right? Their spouse doesn't need to be exposed to this trauma and doesn't need to hear about the horrific things that they've seen or heard or experienced in their daily life. And so they don't talk about work with their spouse. And then essentially what we see is people getting divorced because they can't decide what to have for dinner, right? This is the thing that I hear all the time is I don't want to tell my spouse what's happening because I don't want them to be impacted. And so when I come home and I've had a really bad day, my spouse asks me what I want for dinner, and I tell them I don't care. But the spouse knows something's wrong and is thinking, you won't talk to me. I don't know what's happening. The only way I can take care of you is by at least giving you like your high preference meal. Let me cook you a meal that you'll like. And the first responder's like, no, actually, I really don't care because I have massive decision fatigue. I cannot think through this. Like, I would eat toast. It doesn't matter to me. Make ramen, right? I don't care. I cannot pick. And then the spouse is back to being like, no, just tell me. Why won't you tell me? And then the first responder's like, why won't you just let me go? Right? Like, I don't care. And then people are getting a divorce because they can't decide what to have for dinner. And it's just this entrenched black and white thinking, not knowing how to communicate. And if we can help our first responders understand the difference between process and content, content is like, I saw these things today. That's irrelevant. What you saw or heard or experienced, that is irrelevant in this context. It is irrelevant. What matters is how you are impacted. What is the process? My day went sideways. I can't stop thinking about this call. Or I can't get this sound out of my head, or I can't stop worrying, about our kids' safety, right? It doesn't matter what the thing was that triggered that, what the details of that were. What matters is you're communicating with your loved ones how you are being impacted. And then they can support you. Oh, you can't stop thinking about this. Okay, let's do something to distract you. I know you love watching the stand-up comedy. Let's watch that together. Or do you want to go work out together? Or do you want to take the dog for a long walk and all, put the kids to bed, right? But then our loved ones can meet us where we're at when they understand what's going on. But we just naturally kind of default to shutting them out because we don't want to traumatize them. And we also see that with colleagues. We'll see people saying, well, I don't want to tell my colleague about this horrible thing that I'm dealing with because I don't want them to be traumatized, or I don't want to stress them out. But we get stuck in content and we forget about process. And I think if we can, again, at the academy level, help our new recruits understand those differences and give them tools for how to communicate with their loved ones and with their friends, man, they're going to be starting on such stronger footing. And also working with family members and loved ones to explain to them, these are some of the experiences that your first responder family member may have. These are some of the ways that they may manifest some of their challenges. And here are some tools for you in your toolbox. Right. And so we need all of these different pieces. We need to teach people how to sleep. People are so bad at sleeping in this space. It's so hard, and knowing how to navigate things when the reality is you aren't going to sleep, right? I mean, I work with spec ops teams and tactical teams, and the reality is that sometimes they're going to be downrange and they're not going to sleep for 72 hours. Right. The idea of like, oh, you need to sleep 8 hours, like that's not on the table. They're not doing that. So if that's not on the table, how can you appropriately manage your caffeine consumption? So that way you have, optimal peak plasma levels of your caffeine. What type of mechanism do you want to be, ingesting the caffeine? What kind of dosing time frame are we looking at? How can you have a period of restorative rest, even if you can't sleep? But if you've got 15 minutes on the helicopter, and you don't have to be totally, activated in those 15 minutes, can we pre-plan how you can get some restorative rest? And so we need to be providing that support as well. It needs to really be thinking about the whole person. And then also talking about what does it mean to have growth mindset and to be forward thinking and how to be a flexible thinker. Just all of these different pieces. That is what a great wellness program would look like, treating the whole person and all the systems that they're involved in, and also promoting people being a whole person. For so many first responders, that is their entire identity. All their friends are first responders. All they do is watch first responder shows or read first responder books or listen to first responder podcasts. And all they do is think about being a first responder and helping people remember that they can have hobbies outside of that, and they can have friends outside of that, and they can, have a life outside of their role as a first responder.
Absolutely. You hit on sleep, which is a big, talking point for me. In the fire service, on average, most firefighters work 56-hour weeks, so 24 on, 48 off. We have a retention recruitment crisis like PD does, but ours really is more from the unwillingness to address the things that are broken in the way that we're worked. Because a police officer, even though they're going to do 12s, they're still working basically a 40-hour work week. Your doctors, your nurses, everyone else. The people that you're going to call to come get your kid out of a burning building at 3 a.m. is working 56. And now, because of overtime, they're working 80 hours that week. And, it's insane. I've had a lot of people from the sleep medicine world and, psychologists and psychiatrists and neuroscientists. But I think it's an important thing to understand. Now, the law enforcement side, I think there are some, forward-thinking ways of giving them more rest and recovery. But when it comes to mental health in the fire service specifically, there's, again, old world thinking. Well, it's what James saw. It was that minivan full of kids. It was, whatever. That's why he's struggling. Now, obviously now we know what happened to James from 0 to 27 before he went into the fire department. But the sleep deprivation is something that they just turned their head against. Like, we don't, that's not a thing, and now people are realizing it is. And there's a movement to go to a 42-hour work week, which is happening here in Florida. And it's amazing to watch. With that all being said, talk to me about the relationship between sleep deprivation and suicide ideation, depression, anxiety, addiction, etc.
I mean, sleep is a cornerstone of our health and wellness, not just our mental health, right? But our physical health, our health in every single aspect. And, I do a lot of, sleep training. So I do a lot of workshops for various different law enforcement groups on sleep, how to sleep, tactical sleep, recovery strategies, restorative rest, all of those pieces. And when I first started doing sleep workshops and sleep training for law enforcement, I was thinking about how do I start the training? What are the most important things to include, in the beginning as we kind of ease into all of this? And I had the first kind of quarter of this training that I was doing where I was talking about sleep hygiene. And I remember putting the training together thinking, gosh, I bet you everybody already knows all about this, and they're going to be bored to tears as I'm lecturing them about sleep hygiene. But on the off chance there's like one or two people, in this group of 50 that don't know, I'm going to include it just in case. And if everybody's giving me these nonverbals of like, we already know all this, move on, I can just like zip through and jump ahead. And so I was nervous about having this chunk of the presentation where everybody was going to be bored. And I was 100% certain that people were going to hate that part of the presentation because it's too repetitive. And then when I fast forward to when I get to the training and I'm starting it and I say, okay, we're going to talk about sleep hygiene. And I'm assuming most of you, already know what that is, but how many of you, haven't heard the term sleep hygiene before? And almost every single person rose their hand. And I just remember being shocked because in grad school, they beat that into you. Sleep is like the number one thing that you address with your patients, right? And I was shocked. I couldn't believe that they hadn't even heard the term sleep hygiene. And so much of the health and wellness stuff that I do revolves around sleep. I don't ever do any sort of wellness workshops or training or consultation without talking about sleep, because a lot of times there are some little things that we can do to shape up sleep in a really big way, like these really small kind of bite-sized changes that we can make to net a really big downstream impact. But I would say just as often I talk with people and what they say is, I've always been a bad sleeper, right? You have two people. You have the one person that's like, I can go to sleep anytime. Look, and they just fall asleep, right? On demand. They can have like 4 espresso shots and just pass out afterwards. And then you have the people that are like, oh, yeah, no, my whole life I've never been a good sleeper. And for the people that have never been good sleepers, they really don't actually have any hope that that could ever change, because that's just what it's been like for them. And there's definitely, these genetic factors that influence somebody's, kind of natural sleep wake cycle, and all sorts of other pieces. But there are many ways that we can help our first responders sleep better, even if they've never been quote unquote good sleepers. And I feel like we just don't even just don't even try. When I first started in this space, a decade ago, I I would go to different trainings that other clinicians were giving for first responders, because I want to know, like, what are my people learning? And even now, right, I'll still go to these other trainings at conferences and things like that. And they get the same content over and over. Don't drink alcohol. You need to sleep 8 hours a night, exercise, and make healthy food choices. I'm like, have you ever met a first responder in your life? This is the most useless information you could give them. First of all, do you think that they don't know that? Right? It's like, oh, I need to do those things. Great. I can just do that now. That's not how that works. How about you give them the tools to do these things? But then after the you need to, do all of these things, they're like, okay, time's up. And people are like, wait, but how do I sleep? Okay, if drinking is the literal only coping skill I have, what might I do if you take that away from me? Right? Like, what, they don't have any other coping skills. And so, we have this huge gap in how we're supporting people. And sleep is a really critical component of that. And we know that, chronic sleep deficits, I won't even say sleep deprivation. Obviously, right, sleep deprivation is a very real thing. But even just on the more mild end of sleep deficits, like somebody's only consistently getting 6 hours of sleep, which most people that I know would be like, wow, 6 hours, that's amazing. But even if you're just getting 6 hours of sleep, we see significant long-term physical health impacts, long-term cognitive impacts, and long-term mental health impacts. If you are not sleeping well, if you're not getting the REM sleep that you need, the stage 3 sleep that you need, the deep restorative sleep where we're having cellular repair, our immune system is strengthening, we're consolidating our memories and what we've learned in the day, and transferring it into long-term memory, we're going to have a really big problem with, learning new skills, being, balanced and having good emotion regulation. Our pain management is going to be way below where it should be. Our stress tolerance, our vulnerability to burnout and moral injury and vicarious trauma is going to skyrocket, because we don't have the cognitive resources necessary to balance those mental health impacts. I mean, it's just staggering how much that impacts things. And even if you just look at burnout, right? So burnout is a very, very specific construct for first responders. We use the term burnout all the time colloquially. Oh, I'm burnt out, just to mean like you're kind of tapped out. You're tired. You need a break. But in the first responder space, burnout is a very specific construct that is directly related to organizational stress. So burnout means that you have experienced so much organizational stress, so much administrative stress, that you are physically, emotionally, psychologically depleted. Burnout, as it relates to organizational stress, is the number one predictor of suicide for first responders. It is not exposure to trauma, which is what everybody thinks. It is consistently shown that organizational stress is the number one predictor of suicide for our people. And that is where we see the biggest gaps in behavioral health support. So much behavioral health programming is, we are giving you, the individual, EAP. We're giving you maybe if you're lucky, you can work out on duty, and maybe you can have a once a year consult, with nutrition, or you can go to this workshop or something like that. And everything is put on the individual. It is your responsibility to do all the things. And if you have a problem, that's because you're not doing the things you should be doing. But that doesn't make any sense when you look at the role of organizational stress, right? There's only so much that an individual can do. They can do all the things to take care of themselves. They can do all the things. But when there is a massive amount of organizational betrayal and moral injury and poor leadership and a toxic culture that is not being addressed in any capacity, we've got a fundamental problem. And that cannot be changed on the individual level. That needs to be addressed on the organizational level. And it is very rare for me to see that being done.
See, that's so pertinent. That goes back to, the narcissist, the psychopath in the position of power. And I see this a lot, the toxic environment that contributes to numerous suicides. And it's another one of the elephants in the room. And the number of people that I've heard that are revered around the country as pioneers in this kind of training or whatever. And you ask them, well, how are you received in your own department? Oh my God, don't even start. And this is the problem, is like now it's kind of the tall poppy syndrome, and they just cut their head off, sit down, shut up, we don't want to hear it. And this is between the sleep deprivation and the woeful work weeks that we've seen in the first responder professions. I mean, out in Southern California, that area, I mean, oh my God, I saw there was a San Jose firefighter that I think they'd made, God, was it like $2 million or $1 million in 3 years, something like that. And that wasn't because that was their base pay. That was overtime, and that's insane. Don't get me wrong. But this is the problem, is that means that person worked, how many 24-hour shifts in that month. And so you've got that sleep deprivation side. Then you add that lack of support and that lack of ownership, because just like COVID, if a fire department, let's say, has turned a corner, well, the conversation still has to be, well, how did we get there? Who was responsible for getting there? We need to change those people and get the people that are going to lead us out of this. So yeah, that toxic, organizational betrayal. You enter this profession, you wear the patch on your shoulder, you're like, I'm part of a tribe, and then one day that tribe turns their back on you because you had a good shoot and they threw you under the bus for the media, or you did everything right, and then you listened to a public complaint and you went on their side, whatever the thing was. And for a lot of these men and women, there's not many straws left on that camel's back before it collapses. And the lack of support, that lack of belonging in the very tribe that you literally swore that you would die for a complete stranger for, I've heard it from over and over again. It's absolutely crushing for some of these men and women.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I hear from people most often when they're really struggling, particularly obviously when the organizational stress is really high, is they'll talk about their unit, their chain of command, their department, whatever their group of reference is, and they say things like, "Yeah, that we eat our young." Right. And it just shows you how impactful those feelings of betrayal are and how prevalent it is. And it's devastating. When we can make meaning from our suffering, right? We're in a good place, right? If the time we spend away from our families is worth it, if our kids' plays and sporting events and vacation days and our physical health and our mental health, if all of these sacrifices that we are making are for the greater good and we feel like they're worth it, we're in a good place. Our suffering has meaning. But when our suffering has no meaning, we feel like nothing we do makes a difference, we're always in the wrong, it's never appreciated, we never have good outcomes for cases or responses or whatever it is, right? Now our suffering doesn't have a meaning anymore. And that's incredibly, incredibly dangerous for our first responders. Because if their suffering doesn't have meaning, what do they do with that? And we don't give them very many tools to navigate that.
Well, this is what you hear even when, the transition into retirement. And again, this is what kills me is
Absolutely.
the numbers that we present as this is how many suicides we have. It's absolute bullshit, because as I say to our military guests, that we don't have a VA for first responders. So they're only counting the people that they know were a suicide, that were wearing a uniform pretty much at the time or within 24 hours, whatever it is, which is the tip of the iceberg compared to how many people took the uniform off for the last time, found themselves in a one bedroom apartment after their divorce. Everything starts flooding and they lost their purpose, they lost their tribe, they lost their identity, and then they make a decision that they can't come back from. So we know that loss of purpose is detrimental, because our retiree death count is a perfect example of that. But we don't acknowledge that group at all. We don't count them. We don't, that's not factored into any of the statistics. So then you have that loss
Yeah.
of purpose. And it could even be just like, take my profession again, sending people off to, responses that just aren't emergencies. And there's a solution for that. It's a 3-tier system where you can use telehealth now to take those calls away. So you've woken up a crew of 4 people to respond to someone, who rolled their ankle 2 days ago and now it hurts a bit. That is
Hmm.
another kind of betrayal. Like, well, I just missed my kids, ballet recital to do this extra shift because you're understaffed. Now I'm running on this bullshit. That's layering it too. So I couldn't agree more. Like, if you're going to
Absolutely.
ask these men and women to be away from their families, make make it a lean working environment. Make them stay. When they stay, make sure they're only staying for the smallest amount of time, they perform at the highest level, and then make sure that you kind of curate what they're even responding to so that they do feel like it was worth being there. But we've allowed it to devolve
Yeah.
now, where police, fire, EMS responds to everything. We are the response to every kind of downside of where we failed as a nation from a leadership point of view, from the homelessness to the sex work to the addiction crisis to the gang membership. Well, the first responders will clean it up, they'll be fine. And then you end up, like you said, with this massive moral injury. And in my career, one of the biggest things, it wasn't like I suffered from it, but I felt the weight of it, is the inability to save. You might send me, but some of these people are going to die regardless. Well, that's another moral injury. We did everything right and they still died. And they keep getting sicker and fatter, and the
Exactly.
gang's getting bigger, and then you have that too. So it's a Jenga tower of these elements. And for some of us, like you said, it's that, what do you want for dinner, that's the final straw.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in terms of thinking about retirement, I try to reframe that for the agencies I work with and the units that I work with as transition planning in general, because certainly retirement is a huge gap. We need to be helping people plan for retirement and understand, what they may experience once they transition out of this space, particularly for people where this is their entire identity, right? What can they do to start building up their identity in other areas before they transition out? So we fail majorly with transition planning for retirement. But we also don't do well, at least in law enforcement. I don't think we do well with our individuals that are forced to leave our specialty units. So I'm embedded right with internet crimes against children. So I'm only going to talk about ICAC because that's where I have the greatest expertise. But I'll see my investigators that are in this space, and so many of us are ride or die. This is all we want to do all day, every day, is investigate crimes against children. It is the most righteous, fulfilling work, somebody feels like they could ever do. And this is their passion. And somebody could feel like that about narcotics or counterterrorism, right? That's not unique to ICAC, right? Anybody could feel like that. People can feel like that about patrol. But in this case, in the ICAC example, you have people that are feeling so fulfilled from this work. And I think that there is very little understanding in general from the law enforcement community and from leadership in particular of what ICAC actually is. People think that ICAC is topless 12-year-olds, or like tweens that are sexting. And the reality is, like, we don't even investigate those cases because we don't have enough bodies to do so. We are prioritizing the cases with infants and toddlers, child torture, really, really horrific offending. Those are the cases that we work because we can't work all of them. And so you have people that are working these cases, and then administration will find out, wait, you work child torture cases? You're viewing videos of infants and toddlers being tortured for 4 hours a day sometimes? Oh, that can't be good for you. Okay, we want to protect your mental health. So actually, starting tomorrow, you're going to be in property crimes, or you're going to go back to patrol, or you're going to go wherever, right? Where you're going to go wherever the place is. And I do think, genuinely, I hope at least, that the majority of the time that that happens, it is coming from a place of good intent, absolute ignorance, but hopefully good intent, right? Of thinking, oh my gosh, I had no idea what ICAC was, and now I'm horrified, and I don't want you to not be okay. So I'm going to do you a solid and put you someplace else. And for the people that want to be doing ICAC, that is probably one of the most dangerous things that can happen to them, because they go from doing the most fulfilling, meaningful work to now being in some role where not only do they not find any value in what they're doing, regardless of whether or not we know externally, every single role in the first responder space is incredibly valuable, including the role of a janitor, right? Janitorial staff is critical for the success of first responders, because if the garbage is overflowing and there's no sanitation, like, our first responders aren't going to be able to do their job, right? So literally every role is critical, but it's easy to say that as an outsider. So they go from doing the most fulfilling work they could possibly be doing to now being in this role that doesn't have any value or meaning to them. And not only that, but they are still thinking about the work that they were doing before, and all the children that are being victimized that they're not getting to, their cases that were left unfinished, their incredibly valuable institutional and subject matter expertise knowledge that is now going nowhere. And now they're also with people that are like, oh, you did child sex crimes? I could never do that, right? Like, oh, I don't want to know. And so now they can't even talk about what they experienced. Their gallows humor is horrifying to people, and they have no space to talk about anything, and they're incredibly isolated. And the risk of suicide skyrockets about 6 months post forced transfer from ICAC. The suicide rate skyrockets, and it is just horrifying how little awareness there is about the importance of transition planning. And certainly some agencies have mandatory rotations, right? Like, it is what it is. You're going to rotate every 3 years, every 5 years, or whatever, right? It is what it is. And that's how the agency's set up, and you can't not do that. And even when somebody knows that that's coming, there still isn't transition planning. We're still not preparing them for whatever the next thing is that they're going to go do. And it feels very, very difficult for so many people to move into a different space when that's not what they want. And I think that, whether it's leaving a specialty unit when it's not your choice, or retirement, or going out on disability, right? I know so many people that have had to leave the first responder space because of PTSD or severe depression, or panic or something like that. And they don't want to leave the field. That's not what they want. They're humiliated, they're devastated, they're distressed. And now they have to leave their people, their community, the fulfilling work that they were doing, because they aren't well enough to keep doing it. And that, the moral injury from that alone is so damaging. So we have very little transition support in any of the areas that are needed.
Yeah,
Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox now.
No. I'm going to step up next to you. No, I see this, and another area that I don't think people really comprehend when it comes to my profession is up to the rank of lieutenant, or sometimes captain, depending on the structure. You're still in the station, you're still on the rig, you're still with the crew, you're part of something. But then you promote to battalion chief or admin chief, and now you've gone from that cohesion and that that table where you, exactly like you said, the gallows humor and the banter and the offloading, to now you're pushing papers. Now you're completely detached. So there's retirement, there's the injuries, and even if you do have a medical retirement, one of the things that I can't stand about the way that we do it is now it's like, well, no, you're hurt, so stay hurt. You're not gonna, we're not gonna give you this money if you try and get well. Well, that's such a backward mindset. I mean, what if you spend more time, like you said, with the PT and the rehab, or even, let's really kind of expand a little bit wider. What if it is ibogaine that finally gets you back on your feet, and you can actually then go back to duty, or bring down your disability requirement. But I've got friends that hurt their backs, that literally the whole time when they should have been in the gym, because I hurt my back, and luckily I found movement practices where I never had surgery, but they were like, well, we want to give you light duty. I'm like, no, I'm a full-time athlete rehabbing a sports injury, and so I'm going to go to Cairo, I'm going to go to the gym, I'm going to do movement practices. This is my full-time job now. I'll see you when I'm good again. And that's what I did. But some of my friends went the surgery route, and then they lay on a couch for a year because they were worried that some dude in a bush was going to take a picture of them and then debunk their whole claim. So even when we do have people in that kind of, potentially retiring out, we're not looking at it as a lens of, well, can we at least get you retired at a lower rate so you're healthier and you can go do something else? We're like, well, you're broken, so stay broken and we'll send you a check every month.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It is appalling how we treat people that are going out on disability, whether it's medical or physical or mental health. It's just appalling. And that idea of, you need to stay injured or impaired is wild. When I think about, as you were talking about that, I was thinking about your question earlier about, what might ideal kind of wellness programming look like. And I think, one thing that I didn't mention that I think is really important when considering that gold standard of wellness programming, again, where we have unlimited money and unlimited culturally competent providers, there's a difference between like pull out support. Like, this is the same thing that we talk about with kids at school that need special education services and intervention, right? So you can either remove the child from school and give them the reading intervention or the math intervention or the social skills or whatever the programming is. You can remove the first responder from the field and send them to physical therapy, which actually we don't do. What we do is we make them take sick leave and go on their own time to physical therapy, or, to go see their therapist, or to go do the sleep study or whatever. And then they come back. And when they come back, they've now lost time. They've lost whatever training they were going to get in the field. And now they're bogged down with all these things that they have to do to make up for it. Versus having a push-in model. Oh, you have a back injury? Our culturally competent physical therapist is going to come with you. So we're just going to pull you, off the road or out of your shift while you're still at the precinct, or you're still at the station, or you're still at the office, and you're going to go to the gym with the physical therapist, and they're going to spend an hour with you, and then you can go back to the road or go back to whatever the station, whatever you're doing. Oh, you need some financial counseling or nutritional support, or you need therapy. Yeah, you're doing that while you're on duty, because this is then a work-related injury. And we're going to push in the supports to you on duty. So you're not losing time away from your family. You're not losing your sick leave or your vacation time. And you're getting the supports where you actually need it. And we don't do that. We just don't do that.
Absolutely. Well, you've mentioned ICAC, so let's kind of go back now. You enter the psychology field in higher education. What makes you go down the road of the exploitation of children, and kind of lead me how you found yourself working alongside law enforcement?
So it's actually the opposite of what I always thought I was going to do. I mean, as I mentioned before, I was always really focused on supporting kids and working with kids. And when when I was in college and studying psychology, all my volunteer work, any internships I did, everything was focused on working with kids. At a children's hospital, at a Head Start preschool program, at schools. Everything was was really focused on kids, and in particular, kids that had been victimized or had really unique needs in some sort of capacity. And when I got into grad school, my mentor, this is going back to talking about mentorship, um, Dr. John Thoburn, he fundamentally changed my life in so many ways. I mean, he is like my father. He married my husband and I. He did my son's baby naming ceremony, and he's just such a pillar in my life. And I remember talking to John, maybe my gosh, I mean, it must have been my second year of grad school, and I was, all kids, focused, dialed in, support kids that have been victimized. And John said to me in this really loving, kind way, he's really good at delivering hard feedback. He said, everything that you're doing is focused on working with victims. And that is going to give you only an understanding of a victim mindset. You need to see the other side. You cannot only be focused on this. You're not going to be a good provider if this is all you do. This is all your training and all your experience. You need to have more well-rounded training before you specialize. And of course, I didn't like it when John told me that, and was very like, that can't be right, right? That can't be right. It must be that I should study the thing that I want to specialize in and only that thing. And John was like, no, that's not right. And so I ended up really going to extremes with that feedback. And I did a rotation at our prison here in Washington. And I was there, I was only supposed to be there for a year, and actually I ended up being there for 2 years, and I loved it. It was shocking to me. I thought I was going to hate it. I had no idea what I was doing. I was a baby clinician. I wasn't even a real clinician, right? I'm still in grad school trying to figure out how to do all of these things. How does therapy work? What do you say after, hi, I'm Stacy, right? How do you even start therapy? So I was really in the infancy of trying to figure all of this out. But I had two experiences that were really, really profound. And one of them was this gentleman that I was working with for therapy. And he really was like a dream patient for anybody that is just trying to figure out how this works, like any clinician in the infancy of their career. He was respectful, he came to therapy on time, he showed up to all the sessions, he did his homework, he was insightful, like he was a dream to work with. Like it was so easy, and he was really motivated, and which isn't always the case, especially when you've got somebody that's incarcerated that's going to therapy. You never really know what you're going to get. Are they going to be motivated? Are they doing it because they want to, or are there other reasons, secondary gain? And I really liked him, and I didn't know his criminal history. I didn't look up his criminal history. I was just only focused on, he was severely depressed, had multiple really, really significant suicide attempts that he arguably, I don't know how he survived them. And he made a comment about how he was really relieved that he was incarcerated. He was life without the possibility of parole. And he made a comment about, he knew that if he was ever released from prison, he wouldn't be able to be safe around kids, and he hated himself for that. And I was kind of in that moment where I realized that he was a sex offender, and I put two and two together, and he had been incarcerated for rape of a child, and he'd had a number of other child-related sex crimes before that. And I had this huge kind of internal crisis where I was like, what does this say about me that I liked this person as a patient? And now I'm finding out that I should hate them. They're a horrible person, and I should have no respect for them, and I should hate them. And it did my mind in. It really messed with me for a long time, trying to like reconcile the two, because they just seemed like polar opposites, right? And I have worked with victims for so long that I couldn't wrap my mind around it. And this was exactly the experience that John wanted me to have. And I had to, for a long time, I had to make this gentleman like two different people in my head, right? So like the person that committed those crimes was like this different person, and I was working with this new version of him. And it took me a long time to be able to integrate all of that and to realize that he is a whole person. And there are people in this world that can do horrible things and are not horrible humans. Certainly, you have people that do horrible things and are horrible humans, evil incarnate. There is no place for them in this world. But that's actually probably the exception, not the rule, right? We talked about, there's so many individuals incarcerated that have very similar developmental histories as other people in protector roles, right? And there's these defining features that totally shift the trajectory of their life. And so it really helped me realize how impactful all these different experiences can be, and mentorship and understanding support and redirection and proper intervention. And it really helped me see the shades of gray and really understand the value of early intervention and prevention, and how we can really we can provide an off ramp. Like, people don't have to end up over here. We can change that much earlier if we know how to. So that was this really profound experience for me, and shaped how I viewed kind of working with children that had been victims, how I viewed offenders. And then around that same time, I met a forensic psychologist in the prison, Dr. Brendan Schultz. And I remember meeting him. We had some like weekly psychology meeting where everybody's, we're rounding on everybody's is being seen and all the treatment interventions and things like that. And Schultz was the only forensic psychologist, and he was doing the forensic evaluations for our most violent sex offenders. And was doing a risk and recidivism evaluation to determine if they could be released or if they needed to be civilly committed to a different program once their sentence was over. And I remember him talking about these evaluations, and I was like, what is forensic psychology? What is a forensic evaluation? I mean, I knew what a neuropsych eval was and what a regular psychological evaluation was, but this forensic piece was so new. And poor Brendan, I harassed him so bad, asking him so many questions about what is forensic psychology? What do you do? All the things. And Brendan was like, I don't have time for you. I'm really busy. No, you need to go figure this out on your own someplace else. And I begged him to train me and mentor me. And I remember him being like, okay, you can come and you can sit in my office and watch what I do, but you are not allowed to speak. Do not interrupt me. You just sit there and be quiet. And I was like, done. I will do anything. I need to learn about this. And so after a few days, he was like, okay, fine. You can talk and I will mentor you. And I was ecstatic. I'm really good at just harassing people and wearing them down until they acquiesce to whatever I'm asking for. And so working with Brendan was life changing. The way that I got to use my brain doing these forensic evaluations was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. And you're putting together, you're solving this puzzle, and you don't know what the picture is, and you don't have all the pieces. You don't know where the pieces are that you're missing, and you have to figure all of that out. And so it was this really incredible way of using my brain. And part of doing these forensic evaluations is reviewing, criminal history, records from wherever somebody's been incarcerated, behavioral health records, medical records, all of these pieces. And I found myself being really interested in the law enforcement records, their criminal history. And I always had questions about, what does this mean? Or, why didn't they, ask this question? And I always wanted more information from the law enforcement records, and not like they were lacking in any way. Just I always have 800 questions about everything that I'm doing at any given time. And when I so I discovered this passion for forensic psychology, and that was how I had this dual specialization for child psychology and forensic psychology. And so then I did my internships, I did a dual residency, I did 2 postdocs, everything, equally focused on, child psychology and then forensic psychology. And then I had a practice where I was working with kids and families clinically that had been victimized, and then I was conducting forensic evaluations and testifying as an expert in court. And a lot of the evaluations were around children that had been victimized and looking at, how they'd been impacted and what we needed to do to restore them as much as possible. And then, also evaluating, these offenders and looking at how likely they were to recidivate and, all these other pieces to them. And it was through those forensic evaluations that I had more and more interactions with law enforcement. And I started building these relationships with law enforcement in a way where they became really collaborative. And then I started having investigators call me and say, "Hey, I've got this case. Can I ask you something about it? Or what do you think about this person?" And I mean, I have thousands of hours that I've spent interviewing offenders, some of our most violent offenders, our most violent sex offenders, as well as interviewing our child victims. And so, I've had these experiences that I've been able to view through the lens of a forensic psychologist, and now translate them operationally for law enforcement to help them interpret behavior. And so doing behavioral analysis, criminal behavioral profiling, just kind of emerged naturally from that space. And eventually it became such a huge part of what I was doing that I closed my clinical practice and I became full time embedded with law enforcement. And now I split my time providing behavioral health support to our internet crimes against children investigators and our crimes against children investigators, as well as actually, consulting nationally and internationally on our cases themselves. So I do a lot of consultation for, child torture cases, infants and toddlers, a lot of really horrific dark web, offender behavior, encrypted chat stuff. And I specialize in a lot of undercover work, undercover infiltration and chat and things like that. And it really, it sounds like these things are not at all connected, right? Like, how did I start working with kids that were victims and now end up working with law enforcement and hunting pedophiles? But the reality is, like, it's 2 sides of the same coin, right? These looking at how somebody's developmental history can, like, fundamentally shape them throughout their lives, and how we can have somebody that ends up in this protector role, this first responder role, this hero role, selflessly serving their community, making all these sacrifices for others, doing everything that they can to keep people that are vulnerable safe, and to keep children safe. And then also how things can go sideways, and now we're looking for these offenders and trying to keep them from continuing to create harm. And it feels like it's 2 sides of the same coin to me, and it's just really come full circle.
I mean, such a unique perspective that you have, excuse me. One of the questions I want to ask you, because I've had mixed responses to this, there's many behaviors we've talked about where you can absolutely point to elements of childhood trauma, being unaddressed, that contributed to everything from, struggling with mental health in a uniform to, being an addict living under a bridge somewhere. And, you think, okay, well, if I reverse engineer this and get to that child and send them down a different direction, then maybe they would be, in a much better place. Talk to me about, if any, the common denominators that you see as far as the background of these sex offenders that you've been working their cases.
Oh, goodness. I could talk about this for so long.
Good.
One of my favorite topics. So here's the thing. I think that, in general, sex offenders are really misunderstood, in the sense that, particularly for our child sex offenders, right? So we hear a lot in court from the defense. We hear in the news, these individuals that are arrested for sexually offending against children will say, well, I'm acting out my trauma, or it's because I was victimized myself, and I just didn't know any better. I'm just repeating this pattern, and that sounds kind of like maybe that would make sense. It sounds like that works, from like the surface level place. And actually, it couldn't be further from the truth. And what we know is that, the kids that are victimized, it's like in the single digits, the ones that go on to offend themselves sexually. It's very, very small percentages. And then when we do these, polygraph studies and we look at, offenders that have gone through sex offender treatment and have done all these things, there's a really high percentage of people, of these sex offenders, that will say at the time of their arrest, I was sexually abused as a child. That's my defense for doing this. And like really, really high percentages. And then actually, when you do polygraphs and when you get sex offender treatment programming going, and then you re-examine things, it's actually the equivalent as the general population. So it's maybe like 20-25% of child sex offenders were sexually abused themselves, which is the same as the general population in prison. Like, they're not special in that way. And so then the question is, well, how did this happen? Right? Because we want to have answers. We want to know how we can predict and control that we can prevent that from happening. And the reality is, like, we don't know. We don't know. We know that there are very likely some particularly impactful formative experiences that these individuals have. Even like, aside from that percentage that's sexually abused, that's the same as the general population in prison, right? But there's early exposure to pornography. Adult pornography doesn't have to be child sexual abuse material. You can have physical abuse, neglect, high ACEs for other, in other areas. They could have their own histories of, being bullied or isolated at school, learning disabilities, cognitive delays. There are all sorts of things that stack up. But the reality is we don't really know why individuals become pedophiles or child sex offenders. We just don't, because there are lots of people that could have the exact same developmental history, including, sexual abuse history or early exposure to pornography or things like that, that fundamentally are not sexually attracted to children, will never be sexually attracted to children, and are not going down that path. And we don't really know what distinguishes the two, but we do know that it's not sexual abuse history. And I think that that's really problematic, because obviously that's problematic, but it's particularly problematic depending on the state that you're in and the way that we navigate juvenile offenses. But we have a lot of juveniles that we will come into contact with in the law enforcement space, and we aren't able to prosecute those cases for various reasons. There's a lot of hesitancy to put legal consequences in place for our youthful offenders. And I completely understand that. And we know so much about how incarceration of youth has such negative impacts, and we know all of this research is very clear. And at the same time, when we have a 15-year-old that is downloading and viewing content of infants and toddlers being tortured, we cannot say, well, their parents know about it, it's going to be fine. That's not how that works. Because likely there's a problem in the home. Maybe not 100% of the time, but more likely than not, there's a problem in the home. And the parents know about it, quote unquote, is not that this is not the solution. This is not going to fix anything, right? And even if it were, let's say, again, in this pretend world, Parents are shocked. They find out they have all the money to put their child into treatment and get them all the support they need and pay for the programming at school to support them. We don't actually even have programs to send these kids to. So even if we did have the resources, like the financial resources, and the parents were super dialed in and able to help, we don't have any place to send them. So we're really, really lacking in appropriate intervention for this particular kind of youthful offender. And we're going to be in really hot water because we have this relatively new crime type that is emerging called sadistic online offending, which I know is not the point of our conversation today. But the majority of offenders that are engaging in this behavior are youthful, and we don't know what to do with them. There's also a really high rate of neurodivergence amongst these offenders, and we have no idea what to do with them. There's also a lot of individuals that are first responders that are neurodivergent, and we do not do a good job of providing the right supports to them, because I think that they can people that have a unique way of viewing the world and interpreting data, really can be leveraged. They have such incredible strengths, and we don't navigate that well, I don't think, which is just a side note.
Yeah, no, and it's funny. I see it more and more in our profession. Like you said, there are absolutely assets, but we've also got to navigate, how we see the world, the mental health impact, etc., in uniform too. I want to get to a case when we talk about wrongful convictions in a minute, but that involves a youth offender. But while we're on that topic, firstly, for parents, God forbid, whether it's your own child, whether it's, your child's friend, what would be some of the warning signs that a parent, a teacher would see from a child that maybe is leaning into this kind of crime that you're talking about?
So I'm so glad you asked that. I think when we look at kids, I think the biggest thing for parents, teachers, pediatricians, anybody that's working with kids to look for is a change in their baseline behavior, right? So if you've got a kiddo that is normally really social and outgoing and has a lot of friends and is well liked, and now they are incredibly isolated, they don't spend time with their friends in real life anymore, they're not interested in sports or extracurriculars, they're in their room all the time with the door closed, that's a huge indicator that something's happening. What that is, right? We don't necessarily know, but that's an indicator that something's happening. And as things stack up where now you're seeing kids are having these like disproportionate emotional reactions to things, they're tied to their electronic devices, so they're always on their computer, their laptop, their iPad, their phone, right? Tied to them in a way where parents cannot get them off of them, and if they do try and restrict access, right, there's this massive meltdown or explosive behavior. You see a lot of, for kids that are being victimized, you see a lot of anxiety around being tied to their device. And for kids that are engaging, in offending behavior, you can see a lot of like irritability and aggression around wanting access to their device. Because for a lot of kids, for a lot of youthful offenders that are offending online, usually against other kids, that's not how real life is for them. Usually they're really struggling to navigate the social climate in real life. They can be bullied. They, again, with neurodivergence, right, we can see a lot of difficulty reading social cues and feeling like they fit in with their peers. But when they are online, they can be anything they want to be. And they can script these social communications that they hear their peers saying or that they see in movies, and they can type that out, and nobody knows that they don't actually internally understand what they are supposed to be feeling when they say something like that, because they're just reading it, right? And so they can be whoever they want to be online. And so you'll see them, really feeling fulfilled, really feeling powerful, and loving the leverage that they have over people, and that control and dominance. And they get really fixated on it and will spend their entire day on the computer, their entire day. online. So those big changes in baseline, big changes in interests, changes in relationships with peers. Another thing is that for kiddos that are being victimized, particularly when we look at sadistic online exploitation, there's a wide range of harms that children are forced to engage in by the offender. So we see a lot of self-harm, we see a lot of harm of family pets, harm of siblings. And so you'll have kids that, maybe normally would wear shorts and a t-shirt in the summertime or in the spring, and now they are only wearing long sleeves and long pants. And it's because they don't want anybody to see, the cutting or the self-harm that they've engaged in on their bodies, oftentimes on their chest, on their stomach. And so you'll see this change in how they physically present as well. But it is not uncommon for me to hear from parents that they didn't know that their child was being victimized, or that they didn't know that their child was engaging in offending behavior. Now, sometimes I think parents don't know that their child's engaging in offending behavior out of like willful ignorance. They don't want to know. But there are really two, I'm speaking in very, broad terms here, but there are two types of invisible children. You have your invisible children, your traditional invisible children that we think of, that are, kiddos from these low socioeconomic brackets, minority groups, that are in poverty. Their parents are always working, they're never home, or, parents are using substances and not parenting, right? They're really neglected. You have this kind of traditional group that we might think of. But then you also have kids from well-off families, sometimes even really wealthy families, and their parents are never home, and these kids are invisible because they're wealthy. Nobody's going to report that family to CPS. Teachers aren't going to say anything. They go to these private schools, and they're raised by nannies or raising themselves, and they're just left to their own devices, and they are invisible as well. And it's really, really hard for anybody to even see what's happening in a child if the child is invisible to everybody around them. And in school, we have a really bad habit of, and this is the same thing as what we talked about before with how we navigate first responder issues. But, instead of looking at a kiddo that's having behavior problems and thinking, gosh, what's going on outside of school? Right? We tend to be very punitive. We punish the child. They have exclusionary discipline. They're suspended. They're expelled. They're sent out of the classroom. They lose learning opportunities. They lose opportunities to develop social skills with their peers, and so they just become more and more and more isolated and punished, and believe more and more that they're these bad kids. And then the only other kids that they can hang out with and that will accept them are other quote unquote bad kids, right? Other isolated, marginalized kids. And it's just this really big snowball that's very difficult to derail.
I love that
Did I
phrase
answer your
rather than
question?
say, no, you did absolutely. And I'm going to circle
Okay.
around, but I've always loved that phrase rather than saying what's wrong with you, asking, well, what happened to you? Because it is. When I was talking to my wife the other day, about and my son, he's 18 now, and we're talking about why the girls not always attracted to the nice guys. And I hope to God I've raised him to be a nice young man so far. But when you reflect back, there is a draw to that, but it's almost like you said, a trauma bond. And how many people have gone to their reunions 10, 20 years later, and that heartthrob is now an absolute shit show, or that they're not here anymore, they're behind bars or whatever it is. And so, yeah, I mean, it mirrors exactly what we talked about. When someone's behavior, is not within what we would call the normal parameters, then did they wake up one day to decide to be a dickhead, or is it an outward expression of the pain that's still going on inside their head?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And, especially with kids, I mean, we can put all the intervention possible in place in school. For example, let's say you happen to have a very well resourced school, which is not very common. But let's say you do have a well resourced school and they're pushing all the supports in for the kiddo. It's not going to do a whole lot if we're sending them home to this unsafe, chaotic environment. right? And vice versa. If they're getting support at home, but then we're sending them to school where they're being bullied and victimized and isolated and they don't feel safe or supported or heard and they can't learn, we're going to be in trouble. And so we really need to have, just like we were talking about with like optimal wellness programming for first responders, as holistically focused, looking at the whole person. That's also what we need to be doing for kids. We need to look at the whole child and all of the different systems in their lives and put interventions in place across all of them. And that's really hard to do.
What about prevalence? Obviously, the last 20 years or so, as the internet has really become more popular, as social media has become, a way for us to look through, look through the lens of basically anywhere on the planet now, including war zones. Has this level of sexual abuse of children always been at this level? Are we seeing it increasing because of the visibility, or is it even increasing as far as the frequency? Because the number of men, for example, I've had on the show that were sexually abused when they were younger blew me away. How many people are wearing a uniform now? But then you see so many first responders being caught up in these pedophile rings. So is this a reflection of what we just didn't realize it was behind the curtain, or is this actually getting worse as time goes on?
And that is such a good question. I ask myself that all the time. I talk about that with colleagues all the time. We we don't really know, but I have some hypotheses. I think that, so of course, pedophilia and child sexual abuse. I mean, not everybody that offends against a child is a pedophile. Some people sexually abuse children for other reasons, whether it's power and control motivation, whether they're sadistically motivated, trying to harm the caregiver of the child, other mental health reasons, right? Which also like does people's head ins to think, wait, I'm sorry, people can sexually abuse children when they're not pedophiles, but that's true, right? But we've always seen that type of victimization of children, and when you look at, for example, ICAC, right? People that are viewing child sexual abuse material, so we call that CSAM, or are producing CSAM, things like that. People were always doing that. They just were sending it through the Postal Service, which is why the Postal Service actually was an instrumental agency in standing up our national ICAC task force in the 90s. And so, we saw it manifest differently in print form, and Polaroids, VHS versus, digitally now and on the dark web and encrypted chat, right? I mean, technology is just going so fast. So I think in some respects, we're just identifying it more often. We're coming across it more often, and maybe it wasn't necessarily occurring at a lower rate before. It's just easier to identify now. But which is kind of what I think a lot of people were hypothesizing or have been hypothesizing. Except there was a report that recently came out. It came out in 2026, just a few months ago, and it had more than 20,000 respondents. And the individuals that completed the survey were individuals that were searching on the dark web for child sexual abuse material and were encountering child sexual abuse material. So all of these individuals were invited to participate in a survey. And shocker to nobody, offenders lie. So I am always very skeptical of offender-based self-report data because I just in general think it's frequently not accurate. And a perfect example of that is like, you'll hear people talk about female pedophiles, female sex offenders as unicorns, right? That makes me want to poke my eardrum out every time I hear that. And women look like unicorns, female pedophiles look like unicorns because when you look at the criminal-based data, it looks like they're hardly ever occurring, right? The incarceration rates for female sex offenders is like 1 to 3% in the US, compared to male sex offender population. But when you look at victim-based data, it's a very different picture. And actually, up to 24% of pedophiles are women. And I don't math, but even I know that 24%, almost a quarter, is not a unicorn. So we have big issues when we just look at offender reports and offender-based data. So I'm very, very skeptical of that. But this report, not only did they have, more than 20,000 participants, which is a huge number of participants, but this report was completely transparent about the questions that they asked, the validity measures that they used, how they weeded out and detected people that were just, randomly responding or that were intentionally trying to skew the results. A lot of times when I read reports, they are not transparent about that, which also makes me doubt, the veracity of their reporting. But man, this report was phenomenal. And where I'm going with this is that and I think a lot of other people have been under the impression that the majority of the time that that a youth is exposed to child sexual abuse material, in general, the majority is because they're being shown it in an attempt to groom them. That way, somebody can offend against them. Anecdotally, that is what I hear. That's what I see, in victim cases that I work with youth. That's how they're exposed. But what came out from this report is that almost half the time, these individuals reported that they came across child sexual abuse material accidentally. They came across it randomly in a Google search, or it was pushed out in a chat that they were in. And despite the fact that they were exposed accidentally, a huge percentage of that group was then independently searching for that content before they were even 18 years old. So something's happening where even if a youth is not being groomed and being shown that content for grooming reasons, even if they're just exposed accidentally, something's happening, some blend from their developmental history, whatever's happening in their environment. Now that exposure is triggering something in them, and now they are seeking that material out. And we don't know why that's happening, which is terrifying. But that makes me concerned that actually we are legitimately seeing an increase in people seeking out this content and thinking about kids in this way. Now, I don't mean seeing an increase like 100 times more people are doing this now. That's not all what I'm saying. I actually have no idea what the increase would be, right? Could be 2%, could be 30%. We have no idea. And it's probably going to be some time before our data can catch up. But that was a really shocking piece of research that I encountered recently. And that's also really shocking because, like I talked about with the sadistic online exploitation behavior, which is this, new crime type that we're just really struggling to figure out how to navigate. It's currently being classified as domestic terrorism. And I will. This is a hill that I will die on, and people will be mad. But it is fundamentally not domestic terrorism, and I will argue with anybody about that classification. And it's incredibly dangerous to classify this behavior as domestic terrorism because then we do not understand the lens that we need to use to interpret this offending behavior and how the victims are being impacted, which means we don't know how to investigate the cases. We don't know how to identify additional offenders or additional victims. We don't know how to put interventions in place to prevent these youthful offenders from continuing to engage in this behavior. So that's a whole nother conversation that I feel very strongly about. But the point of that is that with the sadistic online exploitation, which in general is not sexually motivated, it's really just motivated by engaging in harm. It's motivated by harm, by feeling powerful, by feeling strong, by feeling special, by racking up points, just like in a video game and getting status. But one of the ways that these offenders create harm is by exposing their victims to CSAM. They're exposing them to child sexual abuse material, and they're making them create that content. And so my concern is man, if this exposure is happening not through grooming with the purpose of sexually abusing this youth, but it's happening through some other type of victimization, what are the downstream implications going to be for these kids that are being victimized this way? And we do not know. We don't know. And we need to figure it out.
Many elements of what you've been describing remind me of Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman's perspective. He wrote a book, Assassination Generation, on the school shootings that we have. And when you break down, and again, we're talking again the COVID, World War I trenches, where every time some god awful massacre happens at a school, it's like, well, are you for guns or are you against guns? That's it. That's the singular conversation, and it's disgusting. But he does a great job of breaking down, everything from operant conditioning through the video games themselves, to the impact of sleep deprivation, to the power that this person who doesn't feel loved or seen in the real world has when they are, player number 6 on this game. And now, literally, as you said, the beating the high score element that we've seen in some of these school shootings. And again, it really alludes to the breakdown of community, of an intact household, of the ability to be seen, to feel safe, to feel loved, and the impact that we're seeing, the ripple effect. And it does seem to be a parallel between that horrendous epidemic that we have in this country especially, and what you're talking about now. Not so much the grooming, the pedophilia, which I want to get to in just a second, but this feeling of being power, this feeling of being special, this feeling of one-upping the other person that did that last time.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're seeing, this huge, it feels like this huge increase in incel culture. We're seeing incel culture coming into mainstream conversations. We're seeing youth radicalized in ways that we just were never anticipating and we didn't see even 5 years ago. And, back to one of the things that we talked about briefly earlier, right? This presence of like neurodivergent youth that are being victimized and also that are engaging in offending behavior. Neurodivergent youth are not more likely to engage in offending behavior in any way, shape, or form. What they are is significantly more vulnerable to exploitation and to being victimized in a way where they become radicalized or become embedded in this offending population. And it's really interesting to see how all of this is growing with more and more kids online. We talked about COVID, right? There were kids that were online then that had never spent any time on a screen, and then that just became the way of life for them. And it's just it's really impacting how our kids are being exploited, how our kids are being exposed to really, really unsafe content, unsafe groups, unsafe, rhetoric, ideology, all sorts of things. And we don't have a lot in place to navigate that. We're really in the infancy of studying this. I do feel hopeful about us getting some insight and getting some programs going to prevent this. I don't know if you know about the group, the Hacking Games. It's a phenomenal group. And what they're doing is they're really looking at how we can take these youth that are online engaging in behaviors that are criminalized, hacking government, infrastructure, or hacking their schools, or, hacking video games and doing all these things, and realizing that, the majority of these youth that are engaging in these like highly criminalized behaviors with pretty significant consequences, they're probably bored to tears in their real life. They're incredibly bright. They have a really hard time connecting with their peers, more likely than not. Parents probably aren't sure what to do with them. They're probably really isolated. And the Hacking Games is saying, hey, kids, you guys, families, if you are realizing that you are struggling in this area, right? You're bored and you're trying to see what else you can hack into, what games you can crack, how you can put all these mods in place. We've got something for you. We can teach you ethical hacking. We can teach you how to be smarter and better at what you're doing and serve your community or serve your country. And here are all these incredible ways that you can learn and grow and actually use your skills for good. So they're working really hard to put those off ramps in place for youth that are maybe engaging in unsafe behavior, are dabbling in it, or are fully engaged in it. And they're giving them these really beautiful off ramps to understand the impact of their behavior and then transition it into something, really resilient and hardy and gritty with post-traumatic growth, and then actually serving their community. And the Hacking Games is also, they've got a nonprofit that's doing really incredible work as well. But that's just one example of a group that's starting to look at how can we really see the bigger picture around these kids that are engaging in unsafe behaviors, and what can we do to put all the supports around them to fundamentally change their developmental trajectory. And the UN is working on research around youth radicalization right now. And, NCMEC and the Canadian Center for Child Protection, right? They've got all these programs to support victims that have been exploited, family therapy, individual therapy. They have, programs to help them take back control of their images online. So we've got a lot of these organizations that are starting to see the whole child and think about how we can holistically support them to get them back on track. So I do feel really hopeful about that. I do think that we will see, huge impacts from that in the long term. But while we're spinning that stuff up, we also really need to be continuing the research and continuing to understand how and why these things are happening, because that is going to enable us to better intervene and to better identify when we can intervene. And so I do feel hopeful about it.
I'm going to go the other side now. We've been talking a lot about these young offenders, and that was fascinating, by the way. And this is the whole point of this, hearing solutions to these problems. That's it. And there's always people out there that have found, maybe not the whole fix, but are moving towards that way. And that's incredibly optimistic. One of the things that I really struggle with, and I've said about this particular case for a long, long time, you have these people in the positions of power who are blatantly grooming or, preying upon children, but because in this case they wear a glove and they can moonwalk, then people are like, oh, no, but that person. So we've got obviously the whole Epstein list, and that's, another separate conversation. But in Netflix, there was just an incredible documentary on the Michael Jackson case. And I've always said, remove the name Michael Jackson, insert the creepy dude from down the street, put all the things that happened. What would you think? He'd be hanging from a tree in 5 minutes. He would. So when you look at the whole Jackson case and you look at the outcry, and then I think it was a $23 million payment to silence that particular child. And then, the outcry then was kind of denied in court. And then later, the adult kids, I forget the names now, but, they say, actually, this did happen. You've got, child sexual material found in the room. There's briefcases full of porn. There's sending away parents. There's the kids always stay in the bed. You remove Michael Jackson, put in any other dude. It's an open and shut case. So talk to me about that, whether it's the Catholic Church, whether it's the scouting organizations. There is a history of people in power who are able to circumnavigate what a normal person would encounter as far as, whether they even made it out alive, the criminal path that they would be put on. So if you wouldn't mind, elaborate on when positions of power actually work against the very thing that you and your law enforcement colleagues are fighting for.
Yeah, we see that all the time. And yeah, I mean, the two examples that you gave are fantastic examples of this. I so I'm going to answer your question by telling a slightly different story. But one of the things that I get asked, because I consult with, with schools and religious institutions and, lots of different groups around keeping kids safe and, navigating, keeping kids safe online, keeping kids safe in person. And, sometimes I'll get calls from schools or religious groups or camps or whatever, and they'll say, hey, we are getting reports that there are a lot of kids that we think may have been victimized by a particular staff member, teacher, or religious leader, whoever, right? But a particular staff member, 15 years ago. We don't know who it is, though, that victimized the kids or that allegedly victimized the kids. How can we figure this out? How do we go about investigating this? Because the victims won't make the disclosure. So what are our options for figuring this out? And you really only need to ask one question. And the question is, who are you 100% certain it is not? And it is almost always that person. Because you hit the nail on the head when you said, like, if it's some creepy person, if it's that real weird teacher that makes your stomach feel all tense and you can like smell them across the room and you just know that there's something wrong, you are never going to leave your child alone with them. We don't leave our children alone with weird, creepy people. Right? Who do we leave our children alone with? The most beloved teachers, leaders, supervisors, coaches, right? The ones that they're always the kids' favorite. They know they remember all the personal details about the kids and the families. They're incredible at grooming, not just the kids, but the parents of the kids and their colleagues, right? They're so well liked, really charismatic. And that is why people leave their children alone with them. And nobody suspects anything because they are so well liked and they have groomed everybody so well that when they invite kids for a sleepover or when they want to give the parents a break and so they'll take the kids camping, or why not take the kids to Disneyland, and they'll parents don't need to worry about it, they'll handle everything. Parents are like, this is great. This is great. This person cares about my kids just like I do. Everybody loves this person. Of course, yeah, we're so lucky that we have this person in our lives, and they just don't think anything of it, right? But any time you hear that a child is sleeping in bed with an adult that is not their parent, well, I don't understand how we could interpret that in any other way, right? Like, no safe grown up would allow another child in their bed, right? So even if your kid's best friend, it's like your kid, right? Your families are super close. That best friend has a sleepover, and let's say that kid is 8 or even 6, and they come into your room in the middle of the night and they're like, "Oh, I'm scared. Can I sleep with you?" A healthy adult is going to be like, "Oh buddy, let's go back to the room and I can sit with you, or we can sit on the couch and I'll read you a book, or do you want to call your mom and dad?" Right? Like, no safe parent is going to be like, "Yeah, kid, get into bed with me." No way, right? Safe grown-ups don't ever ask kids to keep secrets. Safe grown-ups do not put other kids on their lap. Safe grown-ups do not do these things. And so anytime we hear that that is happening with a child, we should automatically assume that we have a massive, massive problem. Anytime a child says, "Oh, so and so tickled me, but they told me to keep it a secret." I'm sorry, what? 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 What was that? What safe grown up is going to ask a child, first of all, to keep a secret? We might ask a child to keep a surprise because we're going to tell somebody shortly and it will make them so happy, right? Like, "Oh, we made this thing for daddy for his birthday. Let's keep this a surprise until next week when we can give it to him," right? Or, "We're having a party. We're going to keep this a surprise." But safe grown-ups don't ask kids to keep secrets. And then also, safe grown-ups are not tickling other people's kids, right? I mean, that's weird. Um, I just, yeah. So I have a lot of parents though that will say like, "Hey, my kid said this thing to me." I think they're probably just confused, right? Like, It's probably not what they thought it was. Like, why would a child say that to you if that's not what happened? This is not a developmentally normal thing for a child to report to their parents. Why would they say that? No, we need to believe our children when they say something like that. But it feels very difficult for parents to wrap their head around when, especially, the person is somebody in a position of power, beloved, has a lot of money or resources or influence. Parents don't want to believe it, and I understand why they don't want to believe it. But we need to believe our children. We need to stop giving people a free pass simply because they have money or power or influence. That's just not how this works.
Why do you think all these years later, even now he's dead as well, but when this whole predator conversation is front and center, now some of it obviously is Hollywoodized, and it's, a kid being thrown in front of the back of in the back of a van in some foreign country, when, even as we know, most of the actual trafficking is happening right here in the US, but it's become a national conversation. Why do you think there's still such a resistance to believe that, for example, in this particular case, that Michael Jackson, who sent people's children, fat parents away, and insisted on the children sleeping in the bed, and we know that there was child pornographic material in the room, like, it is a complete open and shut case that there is still a large portion of the country that are like, no, he was innocent. No, that never happened. No, he was found innocent in a court. Well, so was OJ. And so were a lot of people that did things. That's the part, like, he's already gone now. It's okay to say, maybe I was wrong. But again, with the pandemic, with some of these other things, there seems to be, I feel there's more value in someone just saying, refusing to say, what, I was wrong. I think that sometimes that is more important than people actually acknowledging the truth.
I think that two things I think are really at play in cases like you're referencing. And I mean, just to be clear, like, I didn't work on the Michael Jackson case. I haven't reviewed any evidence. Like, I don't actually have any official, opinions about that. I don't get sued for slander as a clinician, like, commenting on something that I haven't viewed with my own eyes. But I can say, like, in cases like that, which are prevalent, I think on the one hand, we will do anything to avoid what's called cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is when we experience two opposing feelings, or where we believe two opposing things to be true. So, for example, this person is a great musician and changed the face of pop, and has catchy songs, and I love them, and I have great memories from childhood from listening to their songs. And also, they were engaging in horrific offending behavior. Because if both things are true, that feels too uncomfortable. We can't have that, right? So either we have to say, no, their music was never that good, I didn't actually like it. We have to diminish their musical acumen, and then uphold they were engaging in horrific offending behavior. Or we have to say, well, maybe it wasn't that bad, or maybe we don't know the whole story, or somebody's probably just trying to get money. That way we can have this other part be true. No, they are a good musician and a pop idol. But we can't have both things be true. That feels very uncomfortable to have cognitive dissonance like that. And so instead, what we'll do is we choose one to diminish and devalue, to reduce those feelings of discomfort. So I definitely think that happens. The other reality is that one of the things that makes some predators so incredibly skilled, and again, it's usually the ones that are, really well liked and really good at grooming everybody around them and navigating the social climate. But one of the things that they do is they make it so that children doubt themselves, doubt their memory of what happened, doubt their understanding of what happened. And we see that also with parents inadvertently. So if a child says, hey, somebody touched my body this way, or this thing happened, and the parent responds, are you sure? Did that really happening, or are you lying? right? The kid is like, oh my, I mean, I thought it really happened, but maybe I'm lying. Maybe I misremembered that, right? And then, in general, right, victims have a very difficult time reporting off a coherent narrative of their experiences because of the way that the brain is impacting when it is experiencing trauma. And so it's really hard for victims to have this coherent narrative. So a lot of times they'll say, you know, the story one way this time, and then the next time they'll tell it a different way, or they'll remember something that they forgot initially, or vice versa. And that is really just fundamentally how the neuropsychology of trauma works. But to somebody that doesn't know anything about that, it seems like you're going to doubt the veracity of their reporting. It seems like they're not being honest, and you can't trust what they're saying because their story is changing. It sounds good to be like, well, if somebody's telling the truth, they're going to just tell the same story every time. But actually, when somebody tells me the exact same story every time, I actually am probably going to question that a little bit, because that sounds pretty well rehearsed. And I don't mean like somebody that's done a lot of therapy, right, and done all the things and can now tell their trauma. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about somebody that is not in survivor mode, right? They're in victim mode and they're talking about how they were victimized. And so I think it's very easy for family members of the offender, for defense attorneys, for people to go on a campaign and make people doubt the truthfulness of a victim's reporting, by highlighting where their story has deviated. I'd see that all the time in the forensic cases I work, where a child will report that they were sexually assaulted at school, and then the school attorneys or the district attorneys will say, well, the child said this thing happened first, and now their story is totally different. And they have the audacity to call into credibility the child's reporting. And honestly, they should be ashamed of themselves. And I don't know how they sleep at night, but that's a different conversation. But we see that all the time, right? Is that they will call into question the truthfulness of the reporting simply because the story changes. Well, why did you say it happened and then you recanted? Well, half the time they're terrified, they're bullied, they're being impacted even more by coming forward with their story. They're pressured under duress into recanting, whether it's by their parents or by external parties, right? Who knows? And so it's really common to see that they'll come forward and then they'll recant, or they'll change something, or they'll come forward. And so it makes people look like they're not being honest in their reporting. But I think the truth is probably the opposite.
Well,
And again, I
that.
haven't evaluated victim statements. I don't have an opinion about anybody in specific. I just like all the disclaimers there, right? But I mean, in general, like I see this all the time in the cases that I work.
I do have an opinion, so I'll say it online because again, I felt this a long time, and I feel watching the court case just verified it. Wade Robson was one of the two that had the outcry much later on. But just to your point, their defense, even though some of these victims had described the room, described where this pornography was, described certain unusual elements of Michael Jackson's genitalia, it was the air quotes wishy-washiness of these children's testimonies that the defense attorney honed in on, so it just goes to show the manipulation, which that's a good segue to the very last thing I'll ask you before we go to some closing questions, because I know we've been talking 2.5 hours already. On the other side of this, I had a guest, Greg Kelly, and there was a show on Netflix called Outcry, and he was a senior in high school football player in Texas, and his parents, I think one of his parents got ill, so they ended up moving to somewhere else. So I think it was his mother could get treatment. So one of the other team members, his friend, offered to put him up in their home. Their home also had a daycare in it. Now, fast forward a few weeks or months, whatever it was, one of the children had an outcry, and Mr. Greg touched me, and off it went. And he was ultimately arrested. He was convicted. Now, bearing in mind, he's, a convicted sex offender, pedophile in prison. I don't know how the hell he even managed to navigate that, survive that. Thank God, an incredible lawyer from, I think it was the Innocence Project, got involved and ended up picking apart the case. And, it was a wrongful conviction. but I can't remember if there was even an admission of guilt at that point. I forget. I don't want to say that because I can't remember 100%. But the yogurt shop murders, the Central Park Five. There's numerous examples of, just as you said, with a child, a grown up now or an 18-year-old being manipulated in interrogation. And I can't remember if it was Brad or someone else I talked to recently said that is the worst way of interrogating because the chances of a wrongful conviction go up exponentially. So I know we kind of touched on it before we hit record. Talk to me now as far as the psychology when it comes to interrogation or interviewing to ensure that you don't get the wrong person, that you don't incarcerate an individual. Meanwhile, in this case, a sexual predator goes free and then ultimately rapes another woman until they figure out who the right person was, which was the roommate, the other player the whole time. So, flipping that on its head now, we've gone from the victim of a predator being discredited for their outcry. Talk to me about how anyone in law enforcement listening can ensure that their investigation, their interview techniques are not entering into the threshold where you're also pursuing a claim of guilt, even though it's coming from the wrong place. I don't know if I phrased that properly.
Yeah. So definitely, one of the things that I spend a lot of time doing is training investigators to better understand the different typologies or motivations for engaging in sexual offending against children. And then what does that mean about, what does that likely, not always, but what does that likely mean about who that person is? How can you establish rapport with them? How can you connect to them quickly and help facilitate a really strong, effective interview? And I mean, all the research shows that, aggressive interviewing is not only not particularly effective, there are a lot of unethical things that can happen, and also bad confessions, bad admissions of guilt, and you don't want that, right? We want to make sure that we are arresting the person responsible for engaging in that offending behavior. And I work with such phenomenal investigators. I feel so fortunate, and I work with some investigators that are so skilled at interviewing. Brad is probably one of the finest interviewers that I've had the pleasure of working with. And Brad and I have worked a number of cases together and talked about interview strategy. I think that there's not a lot of interviewing that's taught. We typically think of like using the read technique, and that was like the be all end all for a very long time. There are some other countries like in the UK where they've got the peace model, but we don't give our investigators a whole lot of variety in terms of like the tools that they can use for interviewing strategies, depending on the type of individual that you're interacting with. And certainly some people have, more opportunities for training than others, but in general, there's not a whole lot that they get. And I think the most important thing is that we need to interact with people from a place of curiosity and from a place of neutrality. So the idea of coming on really strong, we have all this evidence that you don't actually have, or somebody said they saw you, or trying to intimidate somebody into giving a confession, it's not ethical and it's not effective, and we're not going to get anything from that we're going to feel good about. But when you're able to connect with somebody on a human level and approach, their experiences with curiosity, which can be really hard to do when you feel that like shock and horror about their offending behavior, especially take, for example, like a child sexual abuse case, right? It's hard to be curious about how somebody engaged in child sexual abuse when what you feel is shock and horror and maybe a little bit of violence, right? But if we we can stay rooted in the curiosity, we can have these conversations that will create a space for this other person to start to actually open up and talk about their experiences and how they got to where they are. Because there are a lot of individuals that we interview. Again, I'm really like distilling this down to the crimes against children space, but there are a lot of individuals that we interview that that sexually abuse children, that are true pedophiles, are truly sexually attracted to children, and also hate themselves for it, and are ashamed and horrified, but they can't stop themselves from engaging in that behavior. And if we give them a space where they feel safe to finally disclose that, not only are they going to feel this tremendous sense of relief that they've finally told somebody this huge secret that they've been carrying around with them for since they were probably 13, 14, 15 themselves. But they also feel safe enough now to tell us all of the kids that they've victimized. Before, maybe we were going to get only the one victim in the case. But now, because we've treated them with respect like a human, and we've created a space where we're curious and they can make any disclosures, and we're not going to react with disgust and horror, even if that's what they feel and what we feel internally, right? We're not demonstrating that externally. Now they can also tell us all the other things that they've done, all the other victims that they have, all the other behaviors that they've engaged in, and now we can really keep kids safe in a way that is fundamentally different than what we were going to get before. So I think if we can shift how we view offenders for the interview, we can be much more productive.
Beautiful. Well, I want to shift to some closing questions, be mindful of your time before we hit 3 hours. The first question I love to ask, is there a book or are there books that you love to recommend? It can be related to our discussion today or completely unrelated.
I mean, so one book that I really like to recommend may also be traumatizing for people. So there's a caveat, right? The things that I read are probably not normal things for people to read. But there's a book called Predators by I can't remember if it's Anne Salter or Anna Salter. Actually, I have the book on my bookshelf right over there. But it's a phenomenal book, horrifying to read. So just don't keep it on your nightstand and read it in bed. But it is a really good book to read, particularly for individuals in law enforcement that want to better understand how these offenders operate and how they think. But I think it's a really good book, giving a very accurate view of who these people are and how this behavior occurs. So I really like that. There's of course, there's The Body Keeps the Score, which is probably a really common book that people listening to your podcast have already read. But I think that people don't truly understand how much we internalize stress and trauma, and how much just even cortisol, long-term, cortisol production in our body impacts things. Like, it impacts our fertility, our risk of type 2 diabetes, increases our risk of developing osteoporosis and cancer. And so many ways. And understanding how sleep impacts all of that. So that's a really, really good book. I read primarily research articles, less books, because I don't know why. I'm always interested in understanding how somebody got to the conclusions that they've reached, right? And so reading research articles, journal articles is very appealing to me, because I want to be able to analyze the veracity of their findings and look at their methodology for collecting the data and how they analyzed it, and kind of form my own opinions about how I'm interpreting their findings. So a lot of it is research articles. But I think the two books that I would recommend, because I'm an ICAC, is Predators, and then the Body Keeps the Score. Really, really good.
Brilliant.
And there's, Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement by Gil Martin, right? That's really popular. That's a great book for people as well.
What about television, documentaries, and films? Any of those that you love?
Um, well, again, again, being an ICAC, I'm so sorry. Everything is like coming out so biased for me, to the, skewed to the ICAC side, but that's just, I live and breathe that. There is a documentary that came out by the BBC, and it's called The Darkest Web. And it is a difficult watch. I won't lie about that. It's a difficult watch, but it really examines how how offenders are using the dark web to share and exchange child sexual exploitation and abuse material. It looks at how investigators are navigating these cases and the impact that it has on the investigators working these cases. And one of the finest investigators that I have ever had the pleasure of knowing, and that I have the pleasure of calling a good friend of mine, is in that documentary. And even knowing him as a colleague, I work cases with him. I've profiled cases for him. He's also a very dear friend of mine. Even knowing him in that space, just watching this documentary and watching him in this documentary, just fundamentally impacted how I view people that do this work. Still, even though I've been doing this for so long, it's still impacted me, and the impact that this work has on everybody. We all pay to play, and when that payment, that sacrifice has meaning, we're going to be okay. But when there's no meaning behind it, if your agency just rips you away from that work for no reason, because of big egos or out of a misguided attempt to, quote unquote, protect your mental health, it's got catastrophic impacts. And I think that this documentary is incredibly well done and really illuminates a lot of challenges that we're seeing from investigating dark web cases and internet-based crimes to supporting our investigators and figuring out how to navigate prosecuting the cases and how to support victims and all of the pieces. So it's incredibly well done.
Well, speaking of amazing people, is there a person that you recommend to come on this podcast as a guest to speak to the first responders, military, and associated professions of the world?
I mean, Greg Squire. That's who I was just talking about in that documentary. He is an incredible human being, a phenomenal investigator, and is very transparent about how being in the first responder space has impacted him and all of the things that he is doing and has done to continue to be healthy. And he's a huge advocate for, holistic behavioral health support and looking at, all of the different ways that somebody in this space can take care of themselves. We talk about sleep all the time, processing trauma, organizational stress, navigating parenting with, viewing this material. How do you view this material and then parent, right, without like anxiety? And, it's just, it fundamentally changes how you view the world being in this space. And I think that he would be a phenomenal guest.
Oh, I would love to get him on if you're able to help make the connection.
Yeah, happy to do that.
Thank you. All right. Well, then the last question before we make sure everyone knows where to find you. As you just alluded to, a lot of people in the psychology, psychiatry space, they are receiving a lot of trauma as they're listening. Now, you're layering that with the cases that you're working. What are the tools that you use to decompress, to offload some of this trauma so that when you walk through the door and you're simply mom again, you're able to do it with a clear mind?
I feel like it's always a moving target, right? Some days are easier than others. Some weeks are easier than others. I think that Probably one of the biggest ones for me is having really good social support from other colleagues in this space. So for a long time, and I've been doing this work for a long time, and probably for the majority of the 2 decades that I've been working in this space, I didn't have colleagues that I could consult with or that I could call when I was not okay from a case. And it's really only been in the last handful of years that I've cultivated a really phenomenal group of colleagues that know what it's like to be embedded with first responders, that particularly with law enforcement, and I can call them anytime and say, hey, this thing happened. You have a minute. And I can just process with them. And it is so incredibly helpful. The other thing is that, we know all of the research shows how incredibly beneficial mindfulness and meditation are, how incredibly beneficial, yoga is. And one of the best things about that is you don't have to like it in order to benefit from it. So yoga makes me feel violent, but I still benefit when I do it. And I hate mindfulness and meditation. I can't sit still. I always want to be doing something. I fall asleep if I'm trying to meditate. But the great news is I don't have to like any of those things in order for them to deactivate my limbic system for me. I just have to do them. So I really like the Headspace app. I promote it all the time. I am not being paid by them, although they can feel free to give me money if they would like. But I love the Headspace app. I really like the voices that they have, like the narrators for the guided meditations and the exercises from that app. I like that I can select different times and different focuses for the mindfulness and or meditation exercises. But I'll use that. Sometimes I'll use that in the car when I'm driving. Obviously, I'm not closing my eyes, right? But I'm just kind of like quieting my brain, and it's guiding kind of my thoughts, which is mindfulness. Being present and meditation guiding my thoughts, or I'll listen to it when I'm trying to fall asleep if I'm having a hard time turning my brain off. So I really like Headspace, mindfulness and meditation, and then yoga also incorporates those pieces, but it has the the physical fitness piece too, which helps just quiet things down for me a little bit. So yeah, those are my go-tos. And I'm a bibliophile. I love reading. That's the only file that is not bad. So bibliophiles. I'm always reading something different, but I read a lot for pleasure, like nothing that has to do with work, or offenders or criminal behavior or anything like that. So I just read a lot for pleasure, all sorts of different things. And reading is really helpful for me to just turn my brain off. Hard for me to turn my brain off if I'm watching a movie or TV. I'll just get spun up about something and then have lost 20 minutes of whatever I'm watching. But when I am reading, I am super dialed in and don't even hear what's happening in the world around me, much to my family's frustration sometimes. So reading is definitely my go-to for that.
I've used Headspace, I think, for about 10 years now. And I had Andy Puddicombe, the founder, the English voice, on the show. And it was amazing. We actually grew up about 10 miles from each other in England originally. But yeah, I mean, to this
Oh
day.
my gosh.
Yeah, I love it. And same is exactly like you said. Sometimes you feel like you're doing a longer one. Sometimes you're on edge and okay, 5 minutes. That's all I need. 5 minutes for some breath work. But yeah, it's been my
Yeah.
ride and die too. So I can't speak highly enough of it.
Yeah, I love Headspace. Tell him I think he's awesome. He did a great job.
Yeah, I will. I'm trying to get a hold of him again. I think he went and became a monk again because I think he made all that money. Probably wasn't even trying to make all that money, but he did. And I think he sold the business and he's off grid again now. So if I ever reconnect, I'll definitely let you know. All right. So
Perfect.
people listening then, if they want to learn more about you, reach out to you, where are the best places online to do that?
They can find me on my website. It's nothing fancy. It's just drstacycecchet.com. Pretty simple. I recently did a TED talk, a TEDx talk on internet safety and how parents can talk to their kids about that. So for parents that are, struggling to find the right words or figure out how to take those first steps into talking about that with their kids, which can feel so overwhelming and so intimidating. That could be a great resource to help kind of spark some ideas for how to navigate those conversations. But I have a lot of resources on my website, so people can feel free to reach out to me that way.
Brilliant. Well, I want to say thank you so much. I literally could talk for another 3 hours, but my bladder and your time probably won't tolerate that. So I want to thank you. I mean, it's been amazing. We've gone through so many areas from mental health in our professions, the first responders and your world in psychology, all the way through to, the vulnerability of our children and even the potential predatory elements of our children. So I want to thank you so, so much for being so generous with your time today and coming on the Behind the Shield podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. This was wonderful. And my husband always teases me that I can make any conversation end up being about pedophiles. And I've done that today, which wasn't the intention of our conversation. But I've done that once again. So thank you for letting me talk about my most favorite topic, law enforcement wellness and hunting pedophiles. It's great.